Jennifer and Garrett's love story had begun 12 years earlier, in the fall of 2010, at a meeting in Nashville. Jennifer, then a bright-eyed real estate intern, had been tasked with selling raffle tickets. Garrett, fresh out of graduate school and working for a tech startup, found himself drawn to her infectious laugh and ambitious spirit. Their courtship was a whirlwind of coffee dates, weekend hikes, and long conversations about their dreams for the future. Jennifer admired Garrett's intellect and drive, while Garrett was captivated by Jennifer's determination and zest for life. Within a year, they were engaged, and 6 months later, they exchanged vows in a picturesque ceremony overlooking the mountains. The early years of their marriage were marked by hard work and shared goals. Jennifer threw herself into her real estate career, quickly climbing the ranks at her firm. Her natural charm and keen eye for property potential made her a favorite among clients. She had a knack for matching families with their dream homes, a talent that brought her both professional success and personal satisfaction. Garrett's career in software engineering flourished in parallel. His innovative approach to problem-solving caught the attention of industry leaders, and he soon found himself in high demand. Late nights spent coding gave way to leadership roles and speaking engagements at tech conferences. As their careers soared, so did their personal life. They bought their home in Oakwood Estates, a spacious 4-bedroom house that Jennifer had fallen in love with at first sight. Weekends were spent renovating, decorating, and turning the house into a home that reflected their shared tastes and aspirations. To the outside world, Jennifer and Garrett appeared to have it all. They hosted dinner parties where Jennifer's culinary skills shone, and Garrett's dry humor kept guests entertained. They took exotic vacations, posting enviable photos of sunsets in Bali and ski trips in the Swiss Alps. Their social media feeds were a carefully curated showcase of their seemingly perfect life. Yet, as the years passed, subtle cracks began to form in their foundation. The long hours devoted to their respective careers left little time for the passion that had once defined their relationship. Conversations about starting a family were repeatedly postponed, with both citing the need to achieve just one more professional milestone before taking that step. Still, they soldiered on, convinced that their love and shared history would be enough to weather any storm. Neither Jennifer nor Garrett could have predicted the tempest that was about to engulf their lives, threatening to destroy everything they had built together. Fiona Maroney's arrival in Oakwood brought a fresh energy to the neighborhood. At 33, she was starting over after a painful divorce, determined to rebuild her life on her own terms. With her infectious laugh, Fiona stood out among the more conservative residents of the suburb. It was Jennifer who first reached out to Fiona, dropping by with a welcome basket filled with local treats and a bottle of wine. The two women hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared love of art and travel. Jennifer, who had always harbored a secret desire to be more creative, was fascinated by Fiona's stories of teaching art to middle schoolers and her own artistic pursuits. As winter melted into spring, Fiona became a regular fixture at the Hartley home. She and Jennifer would spend weekends exploring local galleries or trying out new recipes in Jennifer's gourmet kitchen. Garrett, initially content to let the women have their girl time, found himself increasingly drawn into their conversations, particularly when Fiona would discuss the latest exhibits at the museum where she volunteered. Fiona's presence seemed to breathe new life into the Hartley social circle. Her quick wit and adventurous spirit added a spark to their dinner parties. She introduced the couple to new restaurants, dragged them to outdoor concerts, and even convinced the usually reserved Garrett to try salsa dancing. For Jennifer, Fiona represented a kind of freedom she had never allowed herself. She admired her friend's ability to reinvent herself after her divorce, to pursue her passions without apology. In Fiona, Jennifer saw a road not taken, a life lived with more spontaneity and less concern for others' expectations. Garrett, too, found himself looking forward to Fiona's visits. Her perspective on art and culture opened up new avenues of conversation, a welcome change from the work-related discussions that had come to dominate his interactions with Jennifer. He appreciated Fiona's ability to draw him out of his shell, to make him see the world through fresh eyes. None of them realized that this newfound friendship was setting the stage for a betrayal that would shatter their lives forever. The seeds of the affair were sown on a balmy evening in late April. Jennifer was out of town for a real estate conference, and Garrett had invited Fiona over for dinner, not wanting to eat alone. As they sat together, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset, something shifted in the air between them. Fiona, feeling bold from the wine and the intimate setting, began to open up about her failed marriage. She spoke of feeling unloved, unappreciated, and ultimately unwanted. Garrett, moved by her vulnerability, found himself sharing his own feelings of disconnection within his marriage. For long hours, the focus on career advancement, the gradual fading of passion all tumbled out in a rush of confession. In that moment of shared loneliness, their eyes met, and the spark that had been smoldering burst into flame. The first kiss was hesitant, almost chaste, but it quickly deepened into something more urgent, more primal. Guilt and desire warred within both of them, but desire won out. That night marked the beginning of their clandestine relationship. In the weeks that followed, Garrett and Fiona constructed an elaborate web of lies to conceal their affair. They stole moments together whenever they could. Lunch breaks spent in secluded corners of parks, fake work events that provided cover for rendezvous at out-of-town hotels, early morning meetings that were really hurried encounters in Fiona's art studio. The affair brought a renewed sense of excitement to both their lives. For Garrett, Fiona represented passion and spontaneity, qualities he felt had been lacking in his life with Jennifer. He reveled in Fiona's artistic nature, the way she saw beauty in the everyday world. For Fiona, Garrett offered stability and intellectual stimulation, a stark contrast to her ex-husband's volatility and disinterest in her work. Yet, even as they reveled in their newfound connection, the weight of their deception hung heavy. There were close calls, a lipstick stain hastily wiped from Garrett's collar, a text message not deleted quickly enough, unexplained absences that required increasingly complex explanations. One particularly close call came during a neighborhood barbecue. As Jennifer chatted with other guests, Garrett and Fiona found themselves alone in the kitchen. Unable to resist, they shared a passionate kiss, only to spring apart at the sound of approaching footsteps. It was Dominic coming to refill his drink. He gave them an odd look but said nothing, leaving Garrett and Fiona to wonder if he had seen anything. As spring turned to summer, the affair intensified. Garrett and Fiona began to talk about a future together. Even as guilt gnawed at them both, they knew they were playing with fire, but neither seemed able or willing to put an end to it. Little did they know that their carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down around them. The first inkling that something was amiss came to Jennifer on a sunny Saturday morning in early June. She had woken early, intending to surprise Garrett with breakfast in bed, only to find his side of the bed empty and cold. His running shoes were by the door, but his car was gone from the driveway. When Garrett returned an hour later, flushed and slightly out of breath, he claimed he had gone for a long run and then driven to pick up fresh bagels. Jennifer nodded, accepting his explanation, but a small seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Jennifer began to notice other small changes in Garrett's behavior. He was more attentive than usual, bringing her flowers for no reason and suggesting date nights out of the blue. Yet at the same time, he seemed distant, often lost in thought, his fingers constantly hovering over his phone as if waiting for a message. Garrett's work hours became erratic. He began coming home later, citing project deadlines and client meetings. But when Jennifer casually mentioned his late nights to a colleague of Garrett's at a social event, the colleague seemed confused, saying things had been relatively quiet at the office lately. Even Garrett's scent seemed different to Jennifer. One night, as she leaned in to kiss him hello, she caught a whiff of an unfamiliar perfume. When she commented on it, Garrett laughed it off, saying he must have picked it up from the crowded elevator at work. Jennifer tried to dismiss her growing unease, telling herself she was being paranoid. After all, this was Garrett. Her Garrett, the man she had built a life with, the man she trusted implicitly. And yet the doubts persisted, nagging at her in quiet moments. She found herself watching Garrett more closely, noting how his eyes would light up when Fiona entered a room, the way their conversations seemed to exclude everyone else. She told herself it was natural. Fiona was their friend, of course Garrett enjoyed her company. But a voice in the back of Jennifer's mind whispered that there was more to it than that. As June wore on, Jennifer's suspicions grew stronger. She began to check Garrett's phone when he was in the shower, scroll through his emails when he left his laptop open. She knew it was wrong, a violation of his privacy, but she couldn't help herself. She needed to know the truth, even as she dreaded what she might find. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Jennifer made a decision. She would follow Garrett and see for herself what he was hiding. Little did she know that her world was about to shatter into a million pieces. On a sweltering afternoon of June 14th, Jennifer's suspicions finally reached a breaking point. Garrett had announced over breakfast that he had a late meeting and wouldn't be home for dinner. A quick call to his office confirmed what Jennifer had begun to suspect. There was no meeting scheduled. Heart pounding, palms sweating, Jennifer decided to follow Garrett. She called in sick to work, something she had never done before, and parked her car a block away from their house. As Garrett's car pulled out of the driveway, Jennifer followed at a discreet distance, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. To her surprise, Garrett headed not towards the city, but to a quiet, tree-lined street on the other side of town. Jennifer's breath caught in her throat as she realized where they were. She watched, a sick feeling growing in her stomach as Garrett parked his car and walked briskly to Fiona's front door. Fiona answered almost immediately, pulling Garrett inside with a smile that Jennifer could see even from her vantage point down the street. The door closed, and Jennifer sat in her car, numb with shock. She had suspected, yes, but seeing it with her own eyes was something else entirely. Unable to bear the thought of what might be happening inside, Jennifer got out of her car on shaky legs. She approached Fiona's house, her mind a whirl of confusion and anger. Through a gap in the living room curtains, she saw them. Garrett and Fiona locked in a passionate embrace, oblivious to the world around them. The sight hit Jennifer like a physical blow. She staggered back, a strangled sob escaping her lips. In that moment, her entire world crumbled around her. Every memory, every shared dream, every promise of forever. All of it was tainted now, corrupted by the betrayal she had just witnessed. Blinded by tears, Jennifer stumbled back to her car. She sat there for what felt like hours, alternating between gut-wrenching sobs and periods of numb disbelief. When Jennifer finally drove home, her mind was racing. She couldn't confront Garrett yet. She needed time to think, to plan. But Fiona, the thought of her former friend going about her day, smug in her betrayal, made Jennifer's blood boil. Before she could talk herself out of it, Jennifer found herself driving to Fiona's house. She parked across the street waiting. When Fiona emerged to water her front garden, Jennifer was out of her car in a flash. Fiona's eyes widened in surprise and then fear as she saw Jennifer approaching, her face a mask of fury. What followed was a confrontation that would be seared into both women's memories forever. A maelstrom of accusations, denials, and finally, painful admissions that would set in motion a chain of events leading to tragedy. In the days following her confrontation with Fiona, Jennifer moved through her life like a ghost. She went through the motions at work, plastered on a smile for the neighbors, and maintained a facade of normalcy with Garrett. But inside she was seething, a cauldron of hurt and rage threatening to boil over at any moment. Jennifer had chosen not to confront Garrett immediately. She told herself it was because she needed time to think, to decide what she wanted to do. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was plotting her revenge. The idea came to her late one night as she lay awake, listening to Garrett's steady breathing beside her. If he could betray her with her best friend, why shouldn't she do the same to him? The thought of hurting Garrett the way he had hurt her brought a grim smile to Jennifer's face, and she knew exactly who she would use to execute her plan. Dominic Feldman, Garrett's best friend since college. Dominic had always been a fixture in their lives, the perpetual bachelor who flitted from one casual relationship to another. Jennifer had caught him looking at her appreciatively more than once over the years, though he had never acted on it out of respect for Garrett. As Jennifer's plan took shape, she began to pay more attention to Dominic. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on her when she wore a particularly flattering outfit, how he always seemed to position himself near her at social gatherings. Yes, Dominic would be perfect for what she had in mind. Jennifer started to engineer situations where she and Dominic would be alone together. She asked for his help with small household tasks when Garrett was out, invited him over for coffee to discuss a fitness plan. Each time she turned up the charm, letting her touches linger, laughing a little too hard at his jokes. As she set her plan in motion, Jennifer felt a twisted sense of justice. Soon, she thought, Garrett would know exactly how it felt to be betrayed by the two people he trusted most. The fact that her actions might hurt Dominic as well barely registered in her mind, consumed as she was by her need for vengeance. Little did Jennifer know that her carefully laid plans were about to backfire spectacularly, setting in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. On a sultry evening in late June, Jennifer put her plan into action. She had invited Dominic over under the pretense of needing help with a leaky faucet, knowing Garrett would be working late. She answered the door in a silk robe, her hair tousled, a glass of wine in hand. Dominic's eyebrows rose slightly at her appearance, but he maintained his usual friendly demeanor. As he worked on the faucet, Jennifer hovered nearby, peppering him with questions about his day, laughing at his jokes, and finding excuses to brush against him. When the job was done, Jennifer suggested they have a drink to cool off. She led Dominic to the living room, sitting close to him on the sofa. As they talked, she gradually steered the conversation towards relationships, lamenting the lack of passion in her marriage. Jennifer leaned in, her robe slipping open slightly. "Dominic, I've always wondered what it would be like between us," she murmured, her hand resting on his thigh. Dominic froze, his eyes wide with shock. He gently removed Jennifer's hand from his leg, putting some distance between them on the couch. "Jennifer, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and concern. "You're my best friend's wife." Jennifer pressed on, desperation creeping into her voice. "Don't tell me you've never thought about it, Dominic. I've seen the way you look at me. We could keep it a secret. Garrett would never have to know." Dominic stood up abruptly. Humiliation washed over Jennifer as she watched Dominic gather his things. She had been so sure he would be receptive, so certain her plan would work. As he reached the door, Dominic turned back, his expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. "I won't mention this to Garrett," he said quietly, "but I think you two need to talk." The door closed behind him, leaving Jennifer alone with her shame and thwarted plans. She sank to the floor, tears of frustration and anger streaming down her face. How had everything gone so wrong? She had only wanted Garrett to feel the same pain she was feeling, to understand the depth of her hurt. As the initial shock of rejection faded, a new fear gripped Jennifer. Despite Dominic's assurance, she couldn't be certain he wouldn't tell Garrett about her attempted seduction. The thought of Garrett finding out, of him having the moral high ground despite his own betrayal, was unbearable. Little did Jennifer know that her worst fears were about to be realized, setting the stage for a confrontation that would end in tragedy. The following evening, Jennifer was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard Garrett's car pull into the driveway. Her hands shook slightly as she chopped vegetables, wondering if this would be the moment when everything came to a head. Garrett entered the house, his footsteps heavy, his greeting lacking its usual warmth. Jennifer's heart raced as she heard him approach the kitchen. When she turned to face him, the look in his eyes confirmed her worst fears. Dominic had told him everything. "Jennifer, we need to talk," Garrett said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "What the hell were you thinking, coming onto Dominic like that?" The knife clattered from Jennifer's hand onto the cutting board. "How dare you stand there and judge me when you've been screwing my best friend behind my back for months?" Garrett's face paled, his anger giving way to shock. "Did you think I was stupid? Did you think I wouldn't notice the late nights, the secret phone calls?" The argument escalated, years of unspoken resentments and frustrations pouring out. They rehashed old arguments, dredged up past hurts, each trying to wound the other as deeply as they had been wounded. As their shouting reached a fever pitch, Jennifer suddenly remembered the gun Garrett had insisted they keep in the house for protection, hidden in a lockbox in their bedroom closet. In that moment, clouded by rage and hurt, it seemed like the only way to make the pain stop. Without thinking, Jennifer sprinted up the stairs, Garrett calling after her in confusion. She fumbled with the lockbox, her hand shaking as she extracted the cold, heavy weapon. Garrett appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening as he saw the gun in Jennifer's trembling hands. Jennifer was beyond reason. All she could see was red, the red of her anger, the red of her pain, the red of the future she had lost. As Garrett took a step towards her, his hands raised in a placating gesture, Jennifer's finger tightened on the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, followed by a deafening silence. Time seemed to stand still in the aftermath of the gunshot. Jennifer stood frozen, the smoking gun still clutched in her shaking hands, as Garrett crumpled to the floor. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood that was quickly spreading across the beige carpet. For a moment, Jennifer couldn't process what had happened. She stared at Garrett's prone form, waiting for him to get up, to yell at her, to do anything. But he remained motionless, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Jennifer's anguished scream pierced the quiet of the suburban evening. She gathered Garrett's lifeless body in her arms, rocking back and forth. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the blood that was soaking into her clothes. In the distance, She could hear the wail of sirens growing closer. A neighbor must have heard the gunshot and called the police. Jennifer knew she should run, should try to hide what she had done, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Garrett's side. As the sirens grew louder, Jennifer's mind raced through the events that had led to this moment. The happy years of her marriage, the gradual drift apart, the affair, her misguided attempt at revenge. It all seemed so trivial now in the face of what she had done. The front door burst open downstairs, and Jennifer could hear the heavy footsteps of police officers entering the house. The Hartley residence quickly transformed into a hive of activity as law enforcement descended upon the scene. Crime scene technicians meticulously combed through the house, photographing evidence and collecting samples. The bedroom, with its blood-stained carpet and discarded weapon, became the focal point of their investigation. Detective Ava Ramirez, a seasoned homicide investigator, took charge of the case. She found Jennifer in the living room, still in her blood-soaked clothes, her eyes vacant and her responses monosyllabic. Despite her state of shock, Jennifer was read her rights and taken into custody. At the police station, Jennifer's initial shock gave way to a flood of emotion. Between sobs, she confessed to shooting Garrett, recounting the events that led to that fatal moment. Detective Ramirez listened impassively, her pen scratching across her notepad as Jennifer poured out her story of betrayal, jealousy, and misguided revenge. As Jennifer's statement was being recorded, other officers were piecing together the puzzle. They interviewed neighbors who reported hearing the couple's argument escalating throughout the evening. Fiona Maroney was brought in for questioning, her tear-stained face a mask of guilt and grief as she confirmed her affair with Garrett. Dominic Feldman provided his own statement, reluctantly sharing the details of Jennifer's failed seduction attempt and his subsequent conversation with Garrett. His testimony painted a picture of a marriage in crisis, pushed to its breaking point by infidelity and misunderstanding. Forensic evidence corroborated Jennifer's confession. Gunshot residue was found on her hands, and the bullet extracted from Garrett's body matched the gun registered in his name. The courtroom was packed each day, filled with curious onlookers eager to witness the unfolding drama of love, betrayal, and murder. Prosecutor painted a damning picture of Jennifer as a woman, consumed by jealousy and rage, who had coldly plotted revenge before resorting to murder. She emphasized the premeditated nature of Jennifer's actions, from her attempted seduction of Dominic to her retrieval of the gun during the argument. The testimony of Fiona Maroney proved to be a pivotal moment in the trial. Tearfully, she recounted her affair with Garrett, admitting to the pain and damage they had caused. Her evident remorse and guilt seemed to sway some jurors, lending credence to the defense's narrative of Jennifer as a wronged wife pushed too far. Dominic Feldman's testimony was equally impactful. He described Jennifer's unsuccessful attempt to seduce him, his voice thick with discomfort as he recounted the details. However, he also spoke of the deep love he had always observed between Jennifer and Garrett, suggesting that their actions were out of character for both of them. Throughout the trial, Jennifer sat quietly at the defense table, her once vibrant presence diminished by grief and regret. When she finally took the stand, her testimony was a heart-wrenching account of a marriage unraveled by miscommunication and betrayal. She expressed deep remorse for her actions, stating that she would gladly trade places with Garrett if she could. 2 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, Judge Harriet Goodwin delivered Jennifer's fate, taking into account the circumstances of the crime and Jennifer's lack of prior criminal history. She sentenced Jennifer to 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As Jennifer was led away in handcuffs, the tragic conclusion of a once happy marriage was complete. The cautionary tale of the Hartleys would long be remembered in Oakwood, a somber reminder of how quickly love can turn to hatred and how devastating the consequences of betrayal can be. Olivia Prescott was born on a crisp day in 1985, the only child of Eleanor and Harrison Prescott. Growing up in the affluent neighborhood of Larchmont, New York, Olivia's childhood was marked by privilege and high expectations. Her father, a prominent corporate lawyer, and her mother, a respected art curator, instilled in her a strong work ethic and a passion for the finer things in life. From an early age, Olivia showed a keen intellect and a flair for the dramatic. She excelled in her studies at the prestigious Chatsworth Academy, Where she was known for her sharp wit and magnetic personality, her teachers often remarked on her ability to command attention, whether she was delivering a speech in debate club or starring in the school's theatrical productions. Despite her apparent confidence, those closest to Olivia sensed an underlying insecurity, a constant need for validation that stemmed from the pressure to live up to her parents' lofty standards. This drive for perfection would follow her into adulthood, shaping her decisions and relationships in ways she could never have anticipated. Upon graduating university, Olivia faced the daunting task of carving out her own path. With her parents' connections and her own impressive resume, she secured a position at a renowned auction house in New York City. It was here, amidst the glittering world of high-end art and wealthy collectors, that Olivia would meet the man who would become her first husband. Woody Fuller swept into Olivia's life like a whirlwind, all charm and sophistication. 7 years her senior, Woody was already making a name for himself in the world of finance, his boyish good looks and quick wit making him a favorite among New York's elite social circles. Their eyes met across a crowded gallery, and from that moment, it seemed as though fate had brought them together. Their courtship was a whirlwind of passion and shared interests. Woody introduced Olivia to the finer points of wine tasting and the thrill of sailing, while she opened his eyes to the nuances of contemporary art and the joys of spontaneous adventure. They complemented each other perfectly, or so it appeared to the outside world. In the spring of 2010, barely a year after they first met, Woody proposed to Olivia during a romantic getaway to the Amalfi Coast. The wedding, held at the luxurious Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, was the social event of the season. The early years of their marriage were a blur of exotic vacations, glamorous parties, and professional triumphs. Olivia thrived in her role as a gallerist, opening her own space in Chelsea with Woody's encouragement and financial backing. Meanwhile, Woody's career in investment banking soared, his natural charisma and sharp instincts earning him a reputation as a rising star on Wall Street. However, as the initial glow of newlywed bliss began to fade, cracks started to appear in their seemingly perfect union. Woody's work hours grew longer, his absences more frequent. Olivia found herself increasingly alone, pouring her energy into her gallery and the charity committees that filled her social calendar. At first, she dismissed the nagging doubts as normal marital growing pains, but as months turned into years, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was missing from their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly between them dimmed to a flicker, replaced by a polite cordiality that felt more like a business partnership than a marriage. By their 5th anniversary, the Fullers had become masters of maintaining appearances. They still attended events together, smiling for the cameras and exchanging pleasantries with friends and colleagues. But behind closed doors, they led separate lives, each silently questioning the choices that had led them to this point of quiet desperation. The facade of marital bliss finally crumbled in the winter of 2016. It wasn't a dramatic revelation or a heated argument that spelled the end, but rather a slow, painful realization that they had grown irreparably apart. She broached the subject of divorce with trepidation, half expecting Woody to fight for their relationship. Instead, she was met with a resigned acceptance that spoke volumes about the true state of their union. It seemed that Woody, too, had been contemplating an exit strategy, though neither had found the courage to voice their discontent until that moment. The legal proceedings were surprisingly amicable. Both Olivia and Woody were determined to avoid a public spectacle, agreeing to a generous settlement that left Olivia financially secure and in possession of their Tribeca loft. Friends and family were shocked by the news, having bought into the illusion of the perfect couple. For Olivia, the divorce brought a mix of relief and profound sadness. While she felt liberated from the constraints of a loveless marriage, she also mourned the death of her youthful dreams and expectations. The failure of her marriage felt like a personal defeat, a blemish on her otherwise meticulously curated life. As the ink dried on the divorce papers, Olivia found herself adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The life she had so carefully constructed lay in ruins around her, and for the first time in her adult life she had no clear path forward. Little did she know that this period of upheaval would set the stage for a series of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. In the aftermath of her divorce, Olivia embarked on a journey of self-discovery and healing. She threw herself into therapy, confronting the deep-seated insecurities and fears that had plagued her throughout her life. Through this process, She began to understand the patterns that had led her into an unfulfilling marriage and vowed to break free from them. Seeking a fresh start, Olivia sold her gallery and took a sabbatical from the art world. She traveled extensively, losing herself in the vibrant markets of Marrakech, the serene temples of Kyoto, and the rugged beauty of the Scottish Highlands. Each destination peeled away another layer of the persona she had constructed, revealing the authentic Olivia that had long been buried beneath societal expectations and personal doubts. As she approached her 33rd birthday, Olivia found herself in a place of contentment she had never known before. She had cultivated a close-knit circle of friends, rediscovered her love for painting, and even adopted a rescue dog named Fitzgerald. Her life was full, and for the first time she felt no pressure to conform to anyone else's vision of success or happiness. It was in this state of newfound self-assurance that Olivia attended a gala for her nonprofit. She had no way of knowing that this event would mark the beginning of a new romance, one that would ultimately lead her down a path she could never have foreseen, toward a future fraught with passion, betrayal, and unthinkable tragedy. The annual gala was in full swing, the grand ballroom of the Museum of Art alive with the chatter of New York's philanthropic elite. Olivia, resplendent in a midnight blue gown, was in her element, moving from group to group with ease, championing her cause with passion and charm. It was during a lull in the evening, as she paused by a display of student artwork, that she first laid eyes on Paul Fisher. Paul stood out in the crowd, his tall, athletic frame lending him an air of distinguished maturity. Unlike many of the attendees who seemed more interested in being seen than in the art itself, Paul was intently studying a painting, his brow furrowed in concentration. Intrigued, Olivia approached him, curious to hear his thoughts on the piece. What followed was a conversation that flowed effortlessly from art criticism to philosophy, punctuated by moments of laughter and shared observations. Paul, she learned, was a professor of literature, with a keen interest in the intersection of visual and written storytelling. As the evening wore on, Olivia found herself increasingly drawn to Paul's quiet confidence and intellectual depth. He lacked the polished veneer of the financial world she had grown accustomed to, instead exuding a genuine warmth and curiosity that she found refreshing. When he asked for her number at the end of the night, Olivia felt a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. Their courtship progressed rapidly, fueled by a shared passion for the arts and a deep emotional connection that took both of them by surprise. Paul was unlike anyone Olivia had ever dated, thoughtful, nurturing, and unafraid to show vulnerability. He encouraged her artistic pursuits, often reading poetry aloud as she painted in her studio. Within 6 months, they were practically inseparable. Paul proposed on a crisp autumn evening in Central Park, presenting Olivia with a vintage emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Overcome with emotion and certainty, Olivia said yes without hesitation. The whirlwind romance culminated in an intimate winter wedding at the New York Public Library, surrounded by their closest friends and family. As they exchanged vows beneath the ornate ceilings of the Rosemane Reading Room, Olivia felt she had finally found her true partner, someone who understood and appreciated her for who she truly was. Little did she know that this moment of perfect happiness was merely the calm before a storm that would shatter her world and challenge everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the capacity for betrayal. The first year of Olivia and Paul's marriage was a blissful honeymoon phase. They settled into a spacious brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, blending their lives and possessions with the excitement of newlyweds. Weekends were spent exploring the city's hidden gems, attending literary events, and hosting intimate dinner parties for their eclectic group of friends. Olivia's nonprofit flourished under her renewed energy and vision, while Paul received a prestigious grant to write a book on the influence of visual arts on 20th century literature. They supported each other's endeavors wholeheartedly, creating a partnership that seemed to embody the ideal of modern marriage. As they settled into a routine, subtle changes began to emerge. Paul, once so attentive and present, started spending more time in his study, citing the pressures of his book deadline. Olivia, while understanding, couldn't shake a creeping sense of déjà vu, memories of all surfacing unbidden. She pushed these thoughts aside, focusing instead on the positives. Unlike her first marriage, she and Paul still shared moments of genuine connection, deep conversations over morning coffee, spontaneous walks in Prospect Park, tender moments of physical intimacy. These reassurances kept her doubts at bay, at least for a time. Yet as their second anniversary approached, Olivia couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. Paul's absences became more frequent, his explanations more vague. He spoke enthusiastically about a new research partner, a fellow professor named Julian, but was oddly reticent about introducing Olivia to his colleague. Determined not to repeat the mistakes of her past, Olivia tried to address her concerns openly. Paul listened attentively, assuring her that nothing was amiss, that he was simply caught up in his work. As winter gave way to spring, Olivia found herself at a crossroads. Should she trust in the strength of their relationship, or listen to the nagging voice of suspicion growing louder in her mind? Little did she know, her decision to seek the truth would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to an unthinkable tragedy. The seeds of suspicion, once planted, grew rapidly in the fertile soil of Olivia's mind. She began to notice small inconsistencies in Paul's behavior. Hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room, unexplained charges on their joint credit card, the faint scent of an unfamiliar cologne clinging to his clothes. At first, Olivia tried to rationalize these observations. Paul was under immense pressure with his book, she told herself. The strange charges were probably research materials. The cologne, perhaps a sample from a department store. But as the anomalies accumulated, she found it increasingly difficult to silence the voice of doubt. One rainy afternoon, while Paul was supposedly at a faculty meeting, Olivia received a call from his department secretary asking if he was feeling better. Confused, Olivia played along, her heart racing as she realized Paul had lied about his whereabouts. This incident became the catalyst for her decision to investigate further. With a mixture of guilt and determination, Olivia began to delve into Paul's life. She scrutinized his schedule, noting patterns in his absences. She pored over phone records, discovering frequent calls to an unknown number. She even went so far as to follow him one evening, watching from a distance as he met a man in a nondescript sedan, their interaction brief, but charged with an intimacy that made her stomach churn. As the evidence mounted, Olivia found herself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sadness. The parallels to her first marriage were unmistakable, yet this time the pain cut deeper. She had opened herself completely to Paul, believing she had finally found true partnership and understanding. Torn between confronting Paul and gathering more proof, Olivia retreated into herself. She threw herself into her work, using her non-profit as a shield against the turmoil in her personal life. Friends noticed her withdrawal, the shadows under her eyes, but she deflected their concerns with practiced ease. Little did Olivia know that her world was about to be shattered in a way she could never have imagined, as the truth she sought would prove far more shocking and devastating than she ever anticipated. On a sweltering July afternoon, Olivia's suspicions reached a fever pitch. Paul had claimed to be attending a weekend literature conference in Boston, but a casual conversation with a colleague revealed no such event was taking place. Heart pounding, palms sweating, Olivia made a decision that would alter the course of her life irrevocably. She followed Paul to a discreet boutique hotel in the West Village, her mind racing with possibilities, each more painful than the last. As she watched him enter the lobby, a familiar figure caught her eye, a man with the confident stride and impeccable suit she knew all too well. It was Woody, her ex-husband, following closely behind Paul. Shock gave way to disbelief as Olivia processed the scene before her. Could it be a coincidence? A chance encounter between her current and former husband? But the furtive glances, the subtle touch of hands as they walked, told a different story. With trembling hands, Olivia followed them into the hotel, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Using a combination of charm and a hastily concocted story about a surprise for her husband, Olivia managed to convince a sympathetic desk clerk to reveal the room number. She stood outside room 507, frozen in indecision, the muffled sounds of conversation seeping through the door. Taking a deep breath, Olivia knocked. The voices inside fell silent. Moments later, Paul opened the door, his face draining of color as he registered Olivia's presence. Behind him, Woody sat on the edge of the bed, shirt unbuttoned, a look of panic etched across his features. The scene before her confirmed Olivia's worst fears, and then some. Not only was Paul having an affair, but he was having it with her ex-husband. The two men she had loved and trusted most in the world had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. Time seemed to stand still as the three of them stared at each other, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. Olivia felt as though she were watching the scene unfold from outside her body, her mind struggling to process the reality of what she was witnessing. It was Woody who broke the silence, his voice hoarse as he uttered her name. "Olivia, I can explain." But there was no explanation that could soften the blow of this betrayal. With a strangled cry, Olivia turned and fled, leaving behind the shattered remains of her trust and the two men who had destroyed it. The days following Olivia's discovery were a blur of pain, anger, and confusion. She shut herself away in their brownstone, ignoring the incessant calls and messages from both Paul and Woody. It wasn't until a week later that she finally agreed to meet with Paul, her emotions having coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. They met at a quiet cafe in Brooklyn, far from their usual haunts. Paul arrived looking haggard, his usual polished appearance marred by days of obvious distress. Olivia, by contrast, was the picture of composure, her face a mask of controlled calm. Paul launched into an explanation, his words tumbling out in a desperate flood. He spoke of a chance encounter with Woody at a literary event, of a connection he couldn't explain or resist. He swore it had started innocently, just two men bonding over their shared history with Olivia, but had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Olivia listened in stony silence, her mind reeling with the implications of his confession. How long had this been going on? How could they have done this to her? Paul pleaded for understanding, for forgiveness, insisting that his love for Olivia was real despite his transgression. But Olivia was beyond understanding. The double betrayal had shattered something fundamental within her. She demanded to know if Woody had known about their marriage from the beginning, if this had all been some cruel joke at her expense. Paul's hesitation before answering told Olivia everything she needed to know. The realization that both men had entered into this affair with full knowledge of its impact on her was the final straw. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing curious glances from other patrons. "I want a divorce," she stated flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "And I never want to see or hear from either of you again." With those words, Olivia walked out of the cafe and out of Paul's life, leaving him calling after her, his pleas falling on deaf ears. In the weeks that followed, Olivia's world spiraled into chaos. She threw herself into her work with a frantic energy, using it as a shield against the pain and betrayal that threatened to consume her. Her friends worried, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the brittleness of her smile, but Olivia rebuffed all attempts at comfort or intervention. Paul continued his campaign for reconciliation, alternating between heartfelt apologies and impassioned declarations of love. Woody, too, reached out, seeking to explain his role in the affair. Their persistent efforts only served to fuel Olivia's growing anger and resentment. One rainy evening, as Olivia sat alone in her darkened living room, a bottle of wine her only companion, something inside her snapped. The carefully constructed facade of control crumbled, leaving raw, unbridled emotion in its wake. In a frenzy, she began to destroy the remnants of her life with Paul, shredding photographs, smashing mementos, her anguished cries echoing through the empty house. It was in this state that she discovered the gun, a small .38 revolver Paul kept locked in his desk for protection. As she held the weapon, feeling its weight and cold metal against her skin, a dangerous calm settled over her. For the first time since the revelation, Olivia felt a sense of power, of control over her situation. The next morning, operating on autopilot, Olivia dressed with meticulous care. She applied her makeup with precision, donned her favorite silk blouse, and slipped the gun into her handbag. She had made a decision, though its full implications had yet to register in her conscious mind. Olivia drove to the familiar address of Woody's penthouse apartment, where she knew both men would be. She had overheard Paul arranging the meeting in one of his many voicemails, a final attempt to sort things out between the three of them. The irony of returning to the home she had once shared with Woody was not lost on her. As she rode the elevator to the top floor, Olivia's mind was eerily quiet. Gone were the swirling thoughts of betrayal and pain, replaced by a singular focus on the task at hand. She didn't know exactly what she planned to do, but she knew with certainty that after today, everything would change. The elevator doors opened, and Olivia stepped out, her hand closing around the cold metal in her purse as she approached the apartment door. The luxurious penthouse, once a symbol of Olivia's past life with Woody, now became the stage for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Olivia entered without knocking, finding Paul and Woody deep in conversation in the living room. Their faces registered shock, then fear, as they took in Olivia's wild-eyed appearance and the gun now gripped tightly in her trembling hand. What happened next was a blur of shouting, pleading, and chaos. Woody attempted to reason with Olivia, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Paul moved towards her, perhaps hoping to disarm her. The first shot rang out, catching Woody in the chest and sending him stumbling backwards over an antique coffee table. Paul froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Olivia, don't do this." But Olivia was beyond words, beyond reason. The second and third shots hit Paul in rapid succession, his body crumpling to the floor beside the man he had chosen over her. As the echo of gunshots faded, an eerie silence descended upon the room. Olivia stood motionless, the gun still raised, smoke curling from its barrel. The magnitude of what she had done slowly began to penetrate the fog of rage and betrayal that had driven her to this point. She looked down at the bodies of the two men she had once loved, their lifeblood staining the plush white carpet. The gun slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. In the distance, she could hear the wail of approaching sirens. A neighbor, no doubt, having called the police upon hearing the gunshots. Olivia made no attempt to flee. She sank to her knees, her mind struggling to process the horrific scene before her, as she waited for the authorities to arrive and bring an end to this nightmarish chapter of her life. The police arrived within minutes, bursting into the apartment with weapons drawn. They found Olivia kneeling on the floor, her once immaculate blouse now spattered with blood, her eyes vacant and unfocused. She offered no resistance as they handcuffed her and led her away, responding to their questions with an eerie calmness that unnerved even the most seasoned officers. The crime scene investigators swarmed the apartment, meticulously documenting every detail of the gruesome tableau. Forensic experts collected blood samples, retrieved bullet casings, and photographed the victims' positions. The murder weapon, still lying where Olivia had dropped it, was carefully bagged and tagged as evidence. At the police station, Olivia was processed and placed in an interrogation room. Detective Elaine Samuels, a veteran of the NYPD's Homicide Division, took charge of the case. She observed Olivia through the one-way mirror, noting the suspect's composed demeanor, a stark contrast to the violent act she had just committed. During the initial questioning, Olivia was surprisingly forthcoming. She recounted the events leading up to the shooting with a detachment that bordered on clinical, as if she were describing a movie she had watched rather than actions she had taken. "Yes, I shot them. They betrayed me. They deserved it." Detective Samuels probed deeper, trying to understand the motivations behind the crime. As Olivia spoke about discovering the affair between her current and ex-husband, flashes of emotion began to break through her calm exterior. Anger, pain, and a profound sense of betrayal colored her words, providing glimpses into the psychological turmoil that had driven her to murder. As the interrogation progressed, Samuels built a timeline of events, corroborating Olivia's story with evidence collected from the crime scene and witness statements from neighbors and friends. The picture that emerged was one of a woman pushed to the brink by an unthinkable betrayal, her actions born of temporary insanity rather than premeditated malice. By the end of that long night, Olivia Prescott Fisher was formally charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. As she was led to a holding cell, the full weight of her actions finally seemed to hit her, and she began to weep uncontrollably. The arrest of Olivia, once a respected figure in New York's art and philanthropy circles, sent shockwaves through the city. Olivia's defense team, led by renowned criminal attorney, quickly began building their case. They argued for a plea of not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, citing the extreme emotional distress caused by the discovery of the affair. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered, and experts were brought in to testify about the psychological impact of such a profound betrayal. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Olivia's actions were premeditated, pointing to her deliberate acquisition of the gun and her journey to confront the victims. They characterized her as a woman scorned, driven by jealousy and a desire for revenge rather than temporary madness. As the trial approached, public opinion was divided. Some saw Olivia as a sympathetic figure, a victim pushed too far by the cruel actions of those she trusted most. Others viewed her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the law into her own hands. The courtroom became a battleground of conflicting narratives. Character witnesses were called, painting contrasting pictures of Olivia's personality and state of mind. Former colleagues praised her dedication and compassion, while acquaintances of Paul and Woody spoke of a woman prone to jealousy and possessiveness. Throughout the proceedings, Olivia sat quietly at the defense table, her face a mask of composed sorrow. She seemed a far cry from the successful, vivacious woman she had once been. The weight of her actions etched in the lines of her face and the dullness of her once bright eyes. Olivia was found guilty of manslaughter, a lesser charge than the original murder accusations. The judge, taking into account Olivia's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances of the crime, sentenced her to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. As the verdict was read, Olivia stood stoically, her composure finally cracking as the reality of her future set in. She was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, leaving behind a gallery of stunned spectators and a society grappling with the tragic consequences of betrayal and uncontrolled emotion. In the end, the story of Olivia served as a somber reflection on the complexities of human relationships, the devastating power of betrayal, and the thin line that separates civilized behavior from primal instinct. Octavia and Oscar Fairweather's love story began like a fairy tale. They met as undergraduates at Creekside College, where Octavia studied art, and Oscar pursued a degree in business administration. Octavia captivated Oscar from the moment he saw her by the campus lake. Oscar, tall and charismatic with a disarming smile, wooed Octavia with his charm and ambition. They married shortly after graduation, with dreams of building a life together in their hometown. Octavia secured a position as an art teacher at high school, where her passion for creativity and nurturing young talent quickly made her a favorite among students and faculty alike. Oscar, leveraging his family connections, landed a job at a prestigious local investment firm, climbing the corporate ladder with remarkable speed. As the years passed, the Fairweathers became pillars of the Creekside community. They were fixtures at galas and town council meetings. Their home in Oakwood Estates, purchased with Oscar's growing wealth, became a symbol of their success. Octavia's artistic touch was evident in every room, from the hand-painted murals in the living room to the carefully curated sculptures in their backyard. To the outside world, Octavia and Oscar were the epitome of a power couple. They complemented each other perfectly, Octavia's creativity balancing Oscar's business acumen, her warmth softening his sometimes brusque demeanor. Friends often remarked on how they still looked at each other with the same adoration they had in college. Yet beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, there were undercurrents of tension. Octavia and Oscar had been trying to conceive for years without success. The strain of fertility treatments and dashed hopes began to wear on their relationship. Oscar threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the office, while Octavia found solace in her art and her students. It was during this challenging time that Octavia's relationship with her mother, Cordelia Prescott, became a source of comfort and support. Cordelia, a widow who lived on the outskirts of town, had always been a free spirit. In her youth, she had traveled the world as a photojournalist, settling down in Creekside only after meeting Octavia's father. After his passing, Cordelia had retreated into a quieter life, focusing on her garden and her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. As Octavia spent more time with her mother, Oscar found himself drawn into Cordelia's orbit as well. What began as polite conversation during family dinners slowly evolved into something more, setting the stage for a betrayal that would tear the Fairweather family apart. The seeds of the affair between Oscar and Cordelia were planted on a crisp autumn evening. Octavia, consumed with preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work, Oscar, feeling neglected and frustrated by the growing distance in his marriage, decided to go to Cordelia's cottage alone, ostensibly to check on his mother-in-law. Cordelia, surprised but pleased by the unexpected visit, welcomed Oscar with a warm smile and a glass of her homemade wine. As they sat in her small, cluttered living room, surrounded by eclectic souvenirs from her travels, Oscar found himself opening up about his marital troubles. Cordelia listened with empathy, her eyes, so similar to Octavia's, filled with understanding. Perhaps it was the wine, or the intimate atmosphere, or simply the need for human connection. But that night a line was crossed. A comforting touch lingered too long. A gaze held more meaning than it should have. By the time Oscar left Cordelia's cottage, both knew that something had irrevocably changed. In the weeks that followed, Oscar and Cordelia manufactured reasons to see each other. Cordelia suddenly needed help with home repairs, while Oscar discovered a newfound interest in gardening. Their clandestine meetings became more frequent, always carefully timed to avoid suspicion. During one of their early encounters, Oscar arrived at Cordelia's cottage to help fix a leaky faucet. As they worked side by side in the cramped space of her bathroom, the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Their hands brushed accidentally, sending electric shocks through both of them. When Cordelia reached past Oscar for a towel, he caught the scent of her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and vanilla that made his head swim. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment neither could look away. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Cordelia was showing Oscar how to prune her rose bushes. As she demonstrated the technique, standing close behind him to guide his hands, both were acutely aware of their physical proximity. The gentle brush of her breath on his neck, the warmth of her body against his back, sent shivers down Oscar's spine. When he turned to ask a question, their faces were inches apart. Time seemed to stand still as they stood there, frozen in a moment of forbidden desire. During a rare moment alone at a family gathering, Oscar and Cordelia stole away to the secluded garden behind the house. Hidden from view by a trellis covered in climbing roses, they gave in to their desires. Their kisses were urgent, hands roaming with a desperation born of stolen moments. As they heard Octavia's voice calling for them, they quickly separated, straightening their clothes and hair. The guilt was immediate, but so was the thrill of their secret affair, adding a dangerous excitement to their illicit encounters. Their affair consumed them, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. In Cordelia's bedroom, a space once reserved for solitary nights, they now created a world of secret passion. The creak of bed springs and hushed whispers became a symphony of their illicit love, playing out against the backdrop of familial betrayal. As their physical intimacy deepened, so too did their emotional entanglement. What had started as a physical attraction morphed into something more complex and dangerous. They began to imagine a future together, heedless of the devastation such dreams would wreak on their family. It was this combination of physical passion and emotional connection that would ultimately lead to their undoing. They justified their actions in whispered conversations. Oscar spoke of feeling unappreciated and misunderstood by Octavia, while Cordelia confessed to a loneliness that had plagued her since her husband's death. They convinced themselves that their connection was special, something that transcended the boundaries of the conventional. As the affair deepened, so did their web of lies. Oscar began to invent business trips and late meetings. Cordelia feigned illness to avoid family gatherings. They communicated through a secret email account and disposable phones, always careful to cover their tracks. But with each deception, the weight of guilt grew heavier. Oscar found it increasingly difficult to look Octavia in the eye, while Cordelia's interactions with her daughter became strained and awkward. The very relationship that had once been Octavia's source of comfort was now tainted by betrayal. Neither Oscar nor Cordelia could have foreseen the devastating consequences their actions would have on the entire Fairweather family. As they continued their illicit liaison, they remained oblivious to the suspicions beginning to form in Octavia's mind. The first inkling that something was amiss came to Octavia on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had decided to surprise Oscar with lunch at his office, only to be told by his confused secretary that he had left early, mentioning a meeting with a client. Octavia brushed it off as a miscommunication, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, Octavia began to notice subtle changes in Oscar's behavior. He was more distracted, often lost in thought during their conversations. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would step out of the room to take calls in hushed tones. When questioned, Oscar would dismiss her concerns with vague explanations about work stress and important deals in the pipeline. Octavia's artistic sensitivity, usually a source of joy in her life, now became a curse as she picked up on minute details that others might have missed. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on Oscar's clothes, a lipstick smudge on a coffee mug he brought home from the office, the way he sometimes avoided her touch. All these observations accumulated in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Her relationship with her mother also began to change. Cordelia, once eager to spend time with her daughter, now seemed distant and preoccupied. Their weekly tea sessions became less frequent, with Cordelia often canceling at the last minute. citing various commitments. When they did meet, Octavia sensed a nervousness in her mother's demeanor, a reluctance to meet her eyes that was entirely out of character. As her suspicions grew, Octavia found herself trapped in a spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. She questioned every interaction, analyzed every word spoken by Oscar and Cordelia. Was she imagining things? Had the stress of their fertility struggles and her upcoming exhibition made her paranoid? Determined to find the truth, Octavia began to investigate discreetly. She checked Oscar's credit card statements, noting several charges at restaurants and hotels that he had never mentioned. She drove by her mother's cottage at odd hours, her heart sinking when she spotted Oscar's car parked down the street on an evening when he was supposedly working late. Each new piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, chipping away at the foundation of trust that had been the bedrock of her life. Octavia's students and colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor, the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands as she demonstrated brush techniques, the forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. As the days passed, Octavia became a shadow of her former self, torn between confronting her fears and clinging to the last shreds of hope that she was mistaken. Little did she know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be even more devastating than she could have imagined. The day Octavia's world shattered began like any other. It was a Saturday, and she had spent the morning at the school, putting the finishing touches on the student art exhibition. Oscar had left early, mumbling something about a golf game with clients. As Octavia drove home, her mind preoccupied with last-minute details for the upcoming show, she decided on a whim to stop by her mother's cottage. Perhaps a cup of tea and a chat would help calm her nerves. As Octavia turned onto the quiet lane leading to Cordelia's home, her heart nearly stopped. There parked behind was Oscar's sleek black sedan. For a moment, Octavia sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation, but deep down she knew. With trembling legs, Octavia approached the cottage. The curtains were drawn, but through a gap she could see movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she used her key to unlock the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The sight that greeted her would be forever seared into her memory. There, on the floral-patterned couch, they were locked in an intimate embrace, oblivious to the world around them. Cordelia's hair was disheveled, Oscar's shirt partially unbuttoned. On the coffee table, 2 half-empty wine glasses stood as mute witnesses to their betrayal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if sensing her presence, Oscar and Cordelia looked up. The expressions on their faces, shock, guilt, and a flicker of defiance. What followed was a blur of emotions and accusations. Octavia's anguished cry broke the silence, startling the guilty pair. Oscar jumped to his feet, stammering excuses and pleas. Cordelia remained seated, her face ashen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Octavia, her voice raw with pain and fury, hurled questions at them. The answers, when they came, were like daggers to her heart. 6 months. It had started as friendship, then evolved. They hadn't meant for it to happen. They were sorry. Unable to bear their presence any longer, Octavia fled the cottage. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind replaying the scene over and over. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the house she had once considered her sanctuary. As she sat in the darkened living room, surrounded by the trappings of her seemingly perfect life, Octavia felt something inside her break. The pain, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of the deception. In that moment, a cold resolve began to form in her heart. Someone would have to pay for this betrayal, and Octavia knew exactly who that someone would be. The events leading up to the fatal shooting unfolded over several tense hours on that warm summer evening. Octavia, having spent the day in a haze of grief and anger, found herself pacing the halls of her home like a caged animal. The tick of the clock in the foyer seemed to mock her, counting down the moments until her world would irrevocably change. As dusk fell, Oscar returned home. He entered cautiously, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. Octavia watched from the shadows of the dining room as he hung up his jacket and loosened his tie, the familiar routine now tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal. Oscar called out Octavia's name, his voice strained with apprehension. When she stepped into the light, he visibly flinched. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant, loving wife he had known. Octavia's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. Oscar, his face a mask of guilt and desperation, launched into a litany of excuses and apologies. He spoke of feeling neglected, of the pressures of work and their fertility struggles. He claimed the affair had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. With each word, Octavia felt her anger rising, a tide of rage threatening to overwhelm her. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Octavia found herself walking to Oscar's study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, a precaution he had insisted on after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. As if in a trance, she retrieved the weapon, feeling its cold weight in her hand. When she returned to the living room, Oscar's eyes widened in shock and fear. He raised his hands, backing away slowly, his words now coming in a panicked rush. He promised to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to save their marriage. But Octavia barely heard him. In her mind, she saw only images of Oscar and Cordelia together, their betrayal playing on an endless loop. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Oscar lunged forward, perhaps trying to disarm her. In that moment of chaos and heightened emotion, Octavia's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confines of the room, followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the tinkling of shattered glass from a fallen picture frame. Oscar staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face as he pressed his hand to his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt crimson. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes locked on Octavia's in a silent plea. As the reality of what she had done crashed over her, Octavia dropped the gun. It clattered to the hardwood floor, the sound jolting her out of her shocked state. She rushed to Oscar's side, her anger instantly replaced by horror and regret. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood. Oscar's breathing was labored, his skin growing pale. With trembling hands, Octavia reached for her phone, dialing 911. Her voice shook as she gave the dispatcher their address, pleading for an ambulance to hurry. As she waited for help to arrive, she cradled Oscar's head in her lap, whispering a mixture of apologies and pleas for him to hold on. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshot, began to gather outside. Through the window, Octavia could see curious faces peering in, their expressions shifting from concern to shock as they took in the scene. She heard muffled voices, someone shouting about calling the police. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked swiftly to stabilize Oscar. Octavia watched, numb with shock, as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. As the sirens faded into the distance, Octavia found herself alone in the house, surrounded by the evidence of her actions. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Detective Mia Davis took charge of the scene, her keen eyes taking in every detail. As officers secured the area and began collecting evidence, Detective Davis approached Octavia, who sat motionless on the blood-stained couch. In a gentle but firm voice, Detective Davis informed Octavia of her rights and asked if she understood what had happened. Octavia, her voice barely audible, recounted the events of the day, the discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the moment the gun went off. Throughout her statement, she seemed almost detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. As Octavia was led away in handcuffs, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She caught glimpses of her neighbors watching from behind hastily drawn curtains, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. At the General Hospital, Oscar Fairweather clung to life in the intensive care unit. The bullet had missed his heart by mere inches, lodging dangerously close to his spine. As he underwent multiple surgeries, a steady stream of colleagues and family friends visited, their hushed conversations in the waiting room filled with speculation and disbelief. Cordelia Prescott, racked with guilt and shame, attempted to visit her son-in-law but was turned away by the Fairweather family. She retreated to her cottage, refusing to answer calls or open her door. The weight of her role in the tragedy seemed to age her overnight, her once vibrant demeanor replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed look. Detective Davis, meanwhile, delved deeper into the case. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and family members, piecing together the events that had led to that fateful night. The more she uncovered about the Fairweather family's history and the affair between Oscar and Cordelia, the more complex the case became. As the investigation progressed, public opinion in Creekside began to shift. What had initially been seen as a clear-cut case of attempted murder in a fit of rage was revealed to be a tragedy born of betrayal and shattered trust. The town found itself divided, with some sympathizing with Octavia's plight, while others condemned her actions as inexcusable regardless of the circumstances. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. Octavia's best friend and fellow art teacher, Zara, came forward with a series of text messages. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Octavia had confided her growing suspicions to Zara, detailing the signs of infidelity she had noticed. The messages revealed Octavia's emotional turmoil and her struggle to confront the truth, providing valuable insight into her state of mind. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the judge called the proceedings to order. The prosecution, led by the ambitious district attorney Vincent Harding, painted a picture of Octavia as a vengeful woman who had committed a premeditated act of violence. Harding argued that the shooting was not a crime of passion, but a calculated attempt to punish both her husband and her mother for their betrayal. Octavia's defense team, headed by the seasoned attorney, presented a different narrative. They portrayed Octavia as a victim of circumstances, a woman pushed to the brink by an unthinkable betrayal. Morales emphasized Octavia's impeccable character, her contributions to the community, and the extreme emotional distress she had been under at the time of the shooting. In their closing arguments, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned pleas to the jury. T.A. Harding emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice, while Morales urged the jurors to consider the extraordinary circumstances and Octavia's otherwise exemplary life. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, a hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Octavia Fairweather now rested in their hands, and with it, the resolution of a tragedy that had shaken the town of Creekside to its core. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Octavia Fairweather guilty of aggravated assault, a lesser charge than the attempted murder the prosecution had pushed for. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs as the verdict was read, with Octavia standing stoically beside her attorney. The judge, taking into account Octavia's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, sentenced her to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Additionally, Octavia was mandated to undergo psychological counseling and complete an anger management program. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient given the severity, while others believed it appropriately balanced justice with compassion. As Octavia was led away from the courtroom, the weight of her actions and the long road ahead seemed to finally settle on her shoulders. Oscar, having recovered from his physical wounds but forever changed by the experience, had moved to a different state to start anew. He and Octavia had divorced during her incarceration, their communication limited to formal letters and occasional phone calls. Despite the pain of their shared past, there was a tentative forgiveness between them, born of mutual understanding and regret. Cordelia had retreated from public life entirely. She lived as a virtual recluse in her cottage, her only contact with the outside world being the occasional visit from a home health aide. The weight of her role in the tragedy had taken a severe toll on her health and spirit. As Creekside slowly heals and life moves forward, the story of Octavia, Oscar, and Cordelia remains a powerful reminder of how quickly and irrevocably lives can change. It challenges us to examine our own relationships, to value the trust placed in us by our loved ones, and to consider the far-reaching impacts of our choices. In the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Heights, a picturesque suburban enclave, the Blackwood residence stood as a beacon of domestic bliss. To the casual observer, Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood epitomized the American dream: successful careers, a beautifully maintained craftsman home, and a marriage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Their neighbors often remarked on the couple's apparent devotion to one another, evidenced by their frequent dinner parties and synchronized jogging routines. But beneath the polished veneer of their seemingly perfect life, the Blackwoods harbored a secret that would ultimately lead to their undoing. For the past 2 years, Zephyr and Lorelei had been active participants in a local swinging community, a lifestyle choice that promised to add excitement and passion to their decade-long marriage. At first, their foray into the world of consensual non-monogamy seemed to reinvigorate their relationship. They spoke of feeling closer, more honest, and more in love than ever before. However, as with many things that glitter, the reality of their chosen path was far more complex and fraught with danger than either could have anticipated. What began as a mutual adventure in sexual exploration would eventually expose deep-seated insecurities and long-buried resentments. This is the story of how a couple's search for excitement and fulfillment led to jealousy, rage, and murder. Zephyr Blackwood was a rising star in the tech scene. With his sharp intellect and innovative ideas, he had quickly climbed the corporate ladder at a leading software company. Colleagues described him as driven, charismatic, and occasionally intense. Standing tall in a runner's physique, Zephyr turned heads wherever he went. Despite his professional success, those closest to him noted a persistent undercurrent of insecurity, stemming from a childhood marked by his parents' messy divorce and his father's subsequent absence. Lorelei Blackwood was Zephyr's perfect complement. A talented freelance graphic designer, she balanced her husband's Type A personality with her more laid-back, creative approach to life. With her warm eyes, infectious laugh, and curves that defied her dedication to yoga, Lorelei was the kind of person who made friends easily and kept them for life. Growing up in a large, boisterous family, she valued connection and openness above all else. The couple met during their senior year at the university. Zephyr was immediately drawn to Lorelei's free spirit and artistic talent, while she found herself captivated by his ambition and hidden vulnerability. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a beachside proposal just 6 months after graduation, and they married a year later in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of their social circle. For the first 7 years of their marriage, Zephyr and Lorelei seemed to have it all. They traveled extensively, built successful careers, and created a home that was the envy of their friends. However, as they approached their mid-30s, a sense of restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but uninspiring glow. It was Lorelei who first broached the subject of exploring new avenues in their sex life. Always the more sexually adventurous of the two, she suggested they attend a few workshops on tantric practices and BDSM. Zephyr, eager to please his wife and reignite their spark, agreed enthusiastically. These workshops opened up new channels of communication between the couple, and they found themselves discussing fantasies and desires they had never before shared. It was during one of these conversations that the topic of swinging first arose. Lorelei had read about it online and was intrigued by the idea of consensual non-monogamy. Zephyr, initially hesitant, warmed to the concept as Lorelei painted a picture of increased intimacy and shared adventures. After months of discussion, research, and soul-searching, the Blackwoods decided to take the plunge. They created profiles on swinger websites, attended a few meet-and-greet events, and finally participated in their first full swap with another couple. The experience was exhilarating, and for a time it seemed to breathe new life into their marriage. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The Blackwoods' entry into the world of swinging was marked by a mix of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. Their first experience, a soft swap with a couple they met through a reputable swinger website, exceeded their expectations. The evening was filled with laughter, flirtation, and a level of sexual tension that neither Zephyr nor Lorelei had experienced in years. As they drove home, hands intertwined, they couldn't stop grinning at each other, already planning their next encounter. Over the next few months, Zephyr and Lorelei became regulars in swinging scene. They attended parties at upscale clubs, participated in intimate gatherings at private homes, and even organized a few events of their own. Their social circle expanded rapidly, filled with like-minded couples who shared their desire for excitement and sexual exploration. Lorelei, in particular, thrived in this new environment. Her natural charisma and open-mindedness made her a favorite among their swinging friends. She reveled in the attention she received from both men and women, and her confidence soared. Zephyr, too, seemed to flourish initially. He enjoyed the ego boost that came from other women finding him attractive, and he took pride in having a wife that others desired. The couple's sex life, both with others and between themselves, reached new heights of passion and intensity. They found themselves experimenting with fantasies and kinks they had never before considered. Lorelei would often joke that they were having more sex now than they did in their first year of marriage. As they became more comfortable with the lifestyle, the Blackwoods began to form deeper connections with some of the couples they met. They particularly clicked with Ether and Nova Sterling, a pair of free-spirited artists who had been in the swinging scene for years. The four of them often got together for dinner and drinks, which would invariably lead to steamy encounters that left everyone satisfied. However, as the months wore on, subtle changes began to occur in the dynamics of Zephyr and Lorelai's relationship. While Lorelai continued to embrace the lifestyle with enthusiasm, Zephyr started to show signs of discomfort. He began to notice the way other men looked at his wife, the ease with which she flirted and connected with their swinging partners. What had once been a source of pride now stirred uncomfortable feelings in the pit of his stomach. Zephyr found himself paying closer attention to Lorelai's interactions, especially with Ether Sterling. He couldn't help but notice the lingering touches, the inside jokes, the way Lorelai's eyes seemed to light up in Ether's presence. Rational thought told him that this was all part of the game, that Lorelai always came home with him at the end of the night. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts and fueled his growing insecurity. Despite his misgivings, Zephyr kept his feelings to himself. He didn't want to disappoint Lorelai or appear weak in front of their new friends. Instead, he threw himself into the lifestyle with renewed vigor, as if trying to prove something to himself and others. He initiated more encounters, suggested wilder scenarios, and pushed his boundaries further than he was truly comfortable with. Lorelai, caught up in the excitement and new experiences, failed to notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. She interpreted his increased enthusiasm as a sign that he was enjoying the lifestyle as much as she was. In her mind, swinging had brought them closer together, opening up new avenues of communication and shared experiences. As their second anniversary in the lifestyle approached, the Blackwoods were seen as a success story in their swinging circle. They were attractive, fun, and seemingly more in love than ever. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord had been sown. The very lifestyle that had reinvigorated their marriage was now silently driving a wedge between them, setting the stage for the tragic events that were to come. The first signs of trouble in the Blackwoods' seemingly perfect arrangement appeared subtly at first. Zephyr began to make offhand comments about cutting back on their swinging activities, suggesting they focus more on their own relationship. Lorelai, interpreting this as a passing mood, gently brushed off his concerns and encouraged him to embrace the freedom and excitement they had discovered. As weeks passed, Zephyr's jealousy grew more pronounced. He started to question Lorelai about her interactions with other men, particularly Ether Sterling. His inquiries, initially casual, became more frequent and intense, where once he had enjoyed watching Lorelai with other partners, he now found himself averting his eyes, a knot forming in his stomach. Lorelai, for her part, struggled to understand the change in her husband. She repeatedly assured him of her love and commitment, emphasizing that their adventures in swinging were purely physical and did not threaten their emotional bond. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Zephyr's insecurities deepened. The tension between them began to spill over into their daily lives. Arguments that started about swinging quickly devolved into broader accusations and recriminations. Zephyr would bring up past grievances, questioning Lorelai's fidelity even before they entered the lifestyle. Lorelai, frustrated by what she saw as Zephyr's irrational behavior, found herself becoming defensive and withdrawn. Their professional lives started to suffer as well. Zephyr, usually laser-focused at work, became distracted and irritable. His colleagues noticed the change, whispering about possible troubles at home. Lorelai, whose work required creativity and a positive outlook, found it increasingly difficult to meet deadlines and satisfy clients. Despite the growing discord, Lorelai was reluctant to give up the lifestyle that had brought her so much joy and self-discovery. She suggested they take a break from group activities and focus on one-on-one encounters, hoping this would ease Zephyr's jealousy. But even this compromise led to conflict, with Zephyr accusing Lorelai of trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. As their arguments intensified, the Blackwoods' facade of domestic bliss began to crumble. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, Zephyr suggested they seek counseling. Lorelai agreed, hoping that a professional could help them navigate the complex emotions stirred up by their foray into non-monogamy. However, finding a therapist who was both qualified and non-judgmental about their lifestyle proved challenging, further adding to their frustration. As the date of an upcoming swinger party hosted by the Sterlings approached, the tension in the Blackwood household reached a fever pitch. Lorelai was determined to attend, seeing it as an opportunity to reconnect with friends and reaffirm their place in the community. Zephyr, conflicted and resentful, reluctantly agreed to go, setting the stage for the tragic events that would unfold. The evening of May 15th dawned warm and clear, a perfect spring day. As twilight approached, the Blackwoods began preparing for the Sterlings' party, with an undercurrent of tension thrumming between them. Lorelai hummed to herself as she applied her makeup, choosing a slinky black dress that accentuated her curves. Zephyr, watching her from the doorway, felt a familiar mix of desire and dread coiling in his stomach. They arrived at the Sterlings' upscale loft just as the party was getting started. The spacious apartment was bathed in soft, colorful lights, with sensual music pulsing through hidden speakers. Couples and singles mingled, drinks in hand, the air thick with anticipation and pheromones. Nova Sterling, resplendent in a shimmering gold jumpsuit, greeted them warmly. Zephyr couldn't help but notice how her embrace with Lorelai lingered, the two women exchanging knowing smiles. Ether appeared moments later, clapping Zephyr on the back before placing a gentle kiss on Lorelai's cheek. The knot in Zephyr's stomach tightened. As the night progressed, Zephyr found himself growing increasingly agitated. He watched as Lorelai flitted from group to group, her laughter carrying across the room. She seemed to be in her element, radiating confidence and sensuality. In contrast, Zephyr felt awkward and out of place, nursing the same drink for hours as he observed the interactions around him. The party began to shift gears as couples started to pair off or form small groups, disappearing into the various playrooms the Sterlings had set up. Zephyr lost sight of Lorelai for a while, his anxiety spiking as he searched the crowded loft. He finally spotted her in deep conversation with Ether, their heads close together as they spoke in low tones. Unable to contain himself any longer, Zephyr approached the pair. He caught the tail end of their conversation, something about meeting up later in the week for coffee. Lorelai's eyes widened slightly as she noticed Zephyr, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she composed herself. Zephyr, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, suggested it was time to leave. Lorelai protested, arguing that the night hasn't ended. Their disagreement, though conducted in hushed tones, drew curious glances from nearby guests. Ether, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over, but his intervention only seemed to irritate Zephyr further. As the argument threatened to escalate, Nova appeared, smoothly inserting herself into the situation. With practiced ease, she guided Zephyr and Lorelai to a quiet corner of the loft, encouraging them to take a moment to cool off. She offered them water and gentle words of advice, reminding them of the community's emphasis on open communication and mutual respect. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nova's intervention had diffused the situation. Zephyr took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. Lorelai reached out, squeezing his hand in a conciliatory gesture. But as they stood to rejoin the party, Zephyr caught sight of Ether watching them intently. Something in the other man's gaze, concern, pity, or perhaps something else entirely, caused Zephyr's tenuous control to snap. In a cold, clipped voice, he announced that he and Lorelai were leaving. This time, Lorelai didn't argue. She could see the storm brewing behind Zephyr's eyes, and knew that staying would only lead to a scene. Apologizing profusely to Nova and avoiding Ether's gaze, Lorelai allowed Zephyr to lead her out of the loft. The drive home was fraught with silence, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Lorelai stared out the window, her earlier vivacity replaced by a wary exhaustion. Zephyr gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched as he navigated the nearly empty streets. As they pulled into their driveway, neither made a move to exit the car immediately. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Finally, Lorelai turned to Zephyr, her voice soft but firm as she said, "We need to talk about this. We can't go on like this." Zephyr nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Without a word, he got out of the car and headed for the front door. Lorelai followed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the conversation to come would likely change their lives forever. Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. As soon as the front door closed behind them, the facade of calm they had maintained in public crumbled. Zephyr rounded on Lorelai, his face contorted with a mix of anger and pain. The words tumbled out of him in a torrent of accusations and grievances, all the doubts and fears he had been harboring for months, finally finding voice. He raged about her behavior at the party, the way she had flirted openly with Ether and others. He brought up past encounters, dissecting them with jealous scrutiny, finding evidence of betrayal in the smallest gestures and glances. His voice rose as he spoke of the coffee plans he had overheard, convinced it was proof of an ongoing affair. Lorelei, initially stunned by the ferocity of Zephyr's outburst, found her own anger rising to meet his. She defended herself vehemently, reminding him that openness and honesty had always been the foundation of their relationship and their foray into swinging. She accused him of hypocrisy, pointing out his own enthusiastic participation in their lifestyle choice until recently. Their argument echoed through the house, a cacophony of hurt feelings and misunderstandings. Lorelei tried to reason with Zephyr, to make him see that his jealousy was unfounded, but her words seemed to bounce off him without making an impact. In frustration, she brought up his own dalliances within the swinging community, asking why it was acceptable for him, but not for her. This only served to enrage Zephyr further. He advanced on Lorelei, his tall frame looming over her as he backed her into a corner of their living room. Lorelei, feeling trapped and increasingly frightened by Zephyr's uncharacteristic aggression, attempted to push past him. In that moment, something in Zephyr snapped. As Lorelei tried to move away, he grabbed her arms, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. Lorelei cried out in pain and surprise, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at the man she had loved for over a decade, suddenly unrecognizable in his fury. She struggled against his grip, her own anger giving way to fear as she realized how out of control the situation had become. Zephyr, lost in a haze of jealousy and rage, didn't seem to hear her pleas to let go. In her desperation to break free, Lorelei's hand caught Zephyr across the face, her nails leaving angry red scratches on his cheek. The physical contact seemed to push Zephyr over the edge. With a roar of inarticulate rage, he shoved Lorelei hard. She stumbled backwards, her heel catching on the edge of the area rug. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her arms flailing as she tried to catch herself. But there was nothing to break her fall, and her head struck the corner of the solid oak coffee table with a sickening thud. The sound seemed to snap Zephyr out of his frenzy. He stood frozen, watching in horror as Lorelei crumpled to the floor, a small pool of blood beginning to form beneath her head. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Zephyr's ragged breathing. For several long moments, he remained rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, as if moving through molasses, he stumbled towards Lorelei's motionless form. He fell to his knees beside her, hands shaking as he reached out to touch her. Her skin was still warm, but as he frantically searched for a pulse, he found nothing. The reality of the situation crashed over Zephyr like a tidal wave. He had done the unthinkable. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, he had taken the life of the woman he loved. As the enormity of his actions began to sink in, Zephyr let out a howl of anguish, cradling Lorelei's lifeless body in his arms as tears streamed down his face. In the quiet suburban street outside, a neighbor who had been walking his dog paused, startled by the sound of despair emanating from the Blackwood residence. It was a cry that would haunt the neighborhood for years to come, marking the moment when a loving marriage ended in unimaginable tragedy. The early morning calm of Oak Ridge Heights was shattered by the arrival of police cruisers and an ambulance, their lights painting the tree-lined street in alternating flashes of red and blue. Neighbors emerged from their homes as they watched the unfolding scene, with a mix of curiosity and dread. Detective Rhiannon Frost, a veteran of Homicide Division, arrived on the scene shortly after the first responders. As she ducked under the crime scene tape, she was struck by the contrast between the manicured exterior of the Blackwood home and the chaos that awaited inside. The living room, once a showcase of tasteful decor, now bore the unmistakable signs of violence. The coffee table was askew, a lamp lay shattered on the floor, and at the center of it all was the body of Lorelei Blackwood, partially covered by a sheet. Forensic technicians moved around the room with practiced efficiency, photographing and collecting evidence. Frost's keen eyes took in every detail. Dr. Kai Nakamura briefed her on their initial findings. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head, likely from impact with the corner of the coffee table. Signs of a struggle were evident, including bruising on the victim's arms and defensive wounds on her hands. As Nakamura spoke, Frost's attention was drawn to the figure of Zephyr Blackwood, seated on a dining room chair, his head in his hands. He was still wearing the clothes from the previous night's party, now rumpled and stained. A uniformed officer stood nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the distraught husband. Frost approached Zephyr, her experienced gaze noting his scratched cheek and the smears of blood on his shirt. In a voice hoarse from crying, he began to speak, weaving a tale of a party, an argument, and a tragic accident. As she listened, Frost's instincts told her there was more to the story than Zephyr was revealing. His account seemed rehearsed, lacking the raw emotion one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. She made a mental note to dig deeper into the couple's background and recent activities. Outside, the neighbors huddled in small groups, exchanging shocked whispers and speculative glances. The Blackwoods had always seemed so happy, so perfect. What could have gone so terribly wrong? In the days following Lorelai Blackwood's death, Detective Frost and her team worked tirelessly to piece together the events that led to that fateful night. Their investigation began to reveal a complex web of relationships and hidden tensions that lay beneath the surface of the Blackwoods' seemingly idyllic life. Interviews with friends and colleagues painted a picture of a couple who had recently embraced the swinging lifestyle. While many expressed surprise at this revelation, a select few provided valuable insights into the dynamics of the Blackwoods' open marriage. Nova Sterling, in particular, proved to be a crucial witness, recounting the argument she had witnessed at the party and the obvious tension between Zephyr and Lorelai. As the detectives delved deeper, they uncovered a trail of digital evidence that shed light on the couple's private life. Text messages and emails revealed Zephyr's growing jealousy and Lorelai's increasing frustration with his behavior. Particularly damning was a series of messages between Lorelai and Ether Sterling, discussing Zephyr's recent mood swings and Lorelai's concerns about the future of her marriage. Forensic analysis of the crime scene yielded more damning evidence against Zephyr. The angle and force of Lorelai's fatal injury were inconsistent with a simple fall. DNA evidence under Lorelai's fingernails matched Zephyr's, corroborating the signs of a struggle. Furthermore, toxicology reports showed that while Lorelai had a modest amount of alcohol in her system, Zephyr's blood alcohol level had been significantly higher, suggesting he may have been more impaired than he initially claimed. As the investigation progressed, Detective Frost brought Zephyr in for a series of intense interrogations. Under the relentless pressure of questioning, his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Inconsistencies in his story emerged, and his demeanor shifted from grief-stricken widow to a man consumed by guilt and fear. In a dramatic turn of events, Ether Sterling came forward with additional information. He revealed that Lorelai had confided in him about her plans to leave Zephyr, citing his increasingly controlling and jealous behavior. This revelation provided a possible motive for Zephyr's actions, suggesting that the murder may have been premeditated rather than a heat-of-the-moment crime of passion. The investigation also uncovered financial records indicating that Zephyr had recently inquired about the couple's life insurance policies, adding another layer of suspicion to his actions. Friends reported that he had been under increasing stress at work, with rumors of potential layoffs circulating in his company. As the evidence mounted, the prosecution began to build a strong case against Zephyr Blackwood. The narrative that emerged was one of a man who, faced with the prospect of losing both his wife and his carefully cultivated image of success, had lashed out in a jealous rage with tragic consequences. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the city and beyond, promising to expose the hidden world of suburban swingers and the devastating consequences of jealousy unleashed. Prosecutor Vivian Zhao opened the proceedings with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of a marriage destroyed by jealousy and a woman's life cut tragically short. She promised to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Zephyr Blackwood had murdered his wife in a fit of rage, driven by his inability to control her and his fear of losing her. The defense countered with a narrative of a tragic accident, the result of a loving marriage strained by lifestyle choices that neither party was fully prepared for. Holloway sought to portray Zephyr as a devoted husband, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Nova and Ether Sterling provided crucial testimony about the Blackwoods' involvement in the swinging community and the visible tension between them on the night of Lorelai's death. Their accounts were both illuminating and scandalous, causing a stir in the courtroom and generating salacious headlines. Forensic experts presented detailed analyses of the crime scene, with Dr. Kai Nakamura delivering damning testimony about the nature of Lorelai's injuries. His assertion that the fatal wound was inconsistent with an accidental fall dealt a significant blow to the defense's case. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Zephyr Blackwood himself took the stand. Under Holloway's careful guidance, He presented himself as a man deeply in love with his wife, who had agreed to explore swinging to please her. He spoke of his growing discomfort with the lifestyle and his fears that he was losing Lorelei to it. However, under Zhao's relentless cross-examination, Zephyr's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She confronted him with text messages, emails, and witness statements that contradicted his version of events. As the questioning intensified, Zephyr's composure slipped, revealing flashes of the anger and jealousy that had led to that fatal night. The gallery watched in rapt attention as Zephyr struggled to maintain his story under the prosecution's onslaught. His voice cracked as he recounted the final argument with Lorelei, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might break down and confess. But he managed to hold himself together, sticking to his claim of a tragic accident to the end. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense delivered impassioned closing arguments. Zhao urged the jury to see through Zephyr's lies and hold him accountable for the brutal act that had ended Lorelei's life. Holloway, in turn, pleaded for understanding, asking the jury to consider the complex emotions and circumstances that had led to this tragedy. With the evidence presented and arguments made, the case was turned over to the jury. As they filed out to begin deliberations, a tense hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Zephyr Blackwood now rested in their hands. In the end, the jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Zephyr Blackwood was found guilty of second-degree murder, a decision that sent shockwaves through the community and brought a measure of closure to Lorelei's grieving family and friends. The judge, citing the brutal nature of the crime and Zephyr's lack of remorse, sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. The aftermath of the trial left an indelible mark on the community. The case had exposed the hidden world of suburban swingers, leading to heated debates about morality, trust, and the nature of modern relationships. Some couples who had been part of the lifestyle quietly distanced themselves, while others became vocal advocates for ethical non-monogamy, emphasizing the importance of communication and consent. In the end, the tragic story of Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the strongest relationships can be undone by jealousy, mistrust, and uncontrolled anger. Their story would be remembered not just as a sensational crime, but as a complex human tragedy, born from the eternal struggle between love, desire, and the need for control. At the center of this tragic tale were two individuals whose lives became inextricably intertwined. Evelyn Gosling, a 34-year-old English professor at Briarcliff Community College, was known for her brilliant mind and captivating lectures. Zane Holloway, a struggling freshman with dreams of becoming a writer, was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. What began as mentorship slowly twisted into a web of manipulation, desire, and ultimately murder. As investigators peeled back the layers of their relationship, they uncovered a dark tale of exploitation, obsession, twisted fantasies, and deadly desperation. Evelyn Gosling's journey to Briarcliff was paved with academic accolades and personal turmoil. Born to wealthy parents in Boston, Evelyn showed early signs of exceptional intelligence. Her father, a stern investment banker, and her mother, a socialite with a penchant for cocktails, provided Evelyn with every material advantage but little emotional support. From a young age, Evelyn learned to use her intellect as a shield, burying herself in books to escape the cold reality of her home life. She excelled in school, skipping 2 grades and entering Harvard. It was there that Evelyn discovered her passion for English literature and her talent for captivating an audience. After completing her PhD at Yale, Evelyn seemed destined for a prestigious position at an Ivy League institution. However, a scandal involving an affair with her married thesis advisor derailed those plans. The academic community's whispered judgments and thinly veiled rejection drove Evelyn to seek refuge in the small town of Briarcliff. At Briarcliff Community College, Evelyn quickly established herself as a rising star. Her lectures on Renaissance literature and modern poetry drew students from other departments, and her innovative teaching methods earned her the admiration of both colleagues and students. Dr. Gosling was the epitome of success, brilliant, beautiful, and dedicated to her craft. But beneath the polished exterior lay a woman haunted by her past, and driven by an insatiable need for validation. Evelyn's relationships were often intense but short-lived, leaving her feeling empty and misunderstood. She craved the adoration of her students, basking in their admiration and subtly encouraging their dependence on her guidance. A psychological evaluation conducted after her arrest would later reveal a complex personality disorder characterized by narcissistic traits and a deep-seated fear of abandonment. It was this dangerous cocktail of intelligence, charisma, and unresolved emotional issues that set the stage for her fateful encounter with Zane Holloway. In him, Evelyn saw not just another student to mold, but a chance to reclaim the youth and passion she felt slipping away. Zane Holloway's path to Briarcliff Community College was far from typical. Born in a working-class neighborhood, Zane was the youngest of 4 children in a family that struggled to make ends meet. His father, a construction worker, spent long hours on job sites, while his mother juggled multiple part-time jobs to keep food on the table. From an early age, Zane found solace in the world of books. While his siblings excelled in sports and practical skills, Zane was the dreamer of the family. He would often be found scribbling stories in tattered notebooks or lost in the pages of worn paperbacks borrowed from the local library. Zane's high school years were marked by academic inconsistency. Brilliant in subjects that captured his imagination, like English and history, he struggled with the rigid structures of math and science. His guidance counselor, Ms. Ramirez, recalled, Zane had a spark of genius when it came to writing, but he lacked the discipline and confidence to truly shine. Despite his potential, Zane's grades were mediocre, and his SAT scores fell short of his aspirations. The rejection letters from his dream colleges were a bitter pill to swallow, but beneath Zane's artistic temperament lay a young man grappling with self-doubt and a desperate need for validation. It was this combination of raw talent, emotional vulnerability, and a burning desire to prove himself that made Zane the perfect target for Evelyn Gosling's manipulation. In her, he saw not just a mentor, but a gateway to the intellectual and artistic world he so desperately wanted to join. As the fall semester began, Zane could never have imagined that his pursuit of literary greatness would lead him down a dark path of ethical compromises, emotional entanglement, and ultimately to the shores of Lake Briarcliff, where his young life would be cut tragically short. The first day of advanced composition class was a turning point in both Evelyn and Zane's lives, though neither could have predicted the tragic course their paths would take. Evelyn, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, commanded the room with her presence. Her eyes scanned the sea of fresh faces, pausing momentarily on Zane, hunched in the back row, nervously fiddling with his pen. As Evelyn launched into her introductory lecture on the power of narrative, Zane found himself captivated. Her words seemed to speak directly to him, igniting a passion he had long kept buried. When she asked the class to share their favorite authors, Zane surprised himself by raising his hand. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke of his admiration for James Baldwin, earning an approving nod from Evelyn. After class, Evelyn approached Zane. She'd been impressed by his insight and encouraged him to consider submitting work to the college literary magazine. Zane, flushed with pride, stammered his thanks. This brief interaction planted the seeds of what would become a dangerous obsession for both of them. Over the next few weeks, Zane became a fixture in Evelyn's office hours. What began as discussions about assignments gradually evolved into deep conversations about literature, life, and Zane's aspirations. Evelyn, recognizing Zane's raw talent and vulnerability, began to subtly shape their interactions. She would lean in closely when reviewing his work, her perfume lingering in the air. Her feedback was a careful mix of praise and criticism, designed to keep Zane constantly seeking her approval. She shared personal anecdotes, creating an illusion of intimacy that blurred the lines of the student-teacher relationship. Zane's classmate Amelia later told investigators, "We all noticed how Dr. Gosling treated Zane differently. At first, we were just jealous of the attention, but looking back, there was something off about it." As midterms approached, Zane was struggling in his other classes. The pressure to maintain his scholarship weighed heavily on him. Sensing his distress, Evelyn made her first overt move. After a particularly long office meeting, she placed her hand on Zane's arm and spoke softly. "I see so much potential in you, Zane. I'd hate to see it go to waste because of a few difficult classes. Perhaps we could work out an arrangement to ensure your success." Zane, naive and desperate to prove himself, failed to recognize the dangerous territory he was entering. He interpreted Evelyn's offer as a lifeline, a chance to focus on his true passion without the fear of losing his scholarship. As autumn painted the Briarcliff campus in shades of gold and red, Evelyn and Zane's relationship intensified. She invited him to exclusive literary events, introducing him to her colleagues as a promising protégé. Zane, intoxicated by this new world of intellectual stimulation and perceived belonging, began to rely on Evelyn for more than just academic guidance. Evelyn, for her part, reveled in Zane's dependence. She carefully crafted every interaction to deepen his emotional attachment while maintaining plausible deniability. To her colleagues, she was merely nurturing a gifted student. To Zane, she became the center of his world. By the time the fall semester was coming to a close, the boundaries between mentor and student had become irrevocably blurred. Zane's writing, once filled with diverse influences, now mimicked Evelyn's style and preferences. His social circle had shrunk, with more and more of his time devoted to extra study sessions with Dr. Gosling. Neither Zane nor Evelyn fully realized the dangerous web they were weaving. As the winter break approached, their relationship teetered on the brink of a precipice, ready to plunge into depths from which there would be no return. The winter break marked a critical turning point in Evelyn and Zane's relationship. With the campus largely deserted, they found themselves drawn into a vortex of intensifying emotions and crossed boundaries. Evelyn, under the guise of providing additional mentorship, invited Zane to her off-campus apartment to discuss his final paper for her class. The evening began innocently enough, with Evelyn serving tea and engaging Zane in a heated debate about postmodern literature. But as the hours wore on and inhibitions lowered, the atmosphere shifted. Evelyn, her voice lowered to a near whisper, began to share personal stories of her own struggles as a young academic. She portrayed herself as a misunderstood genius, persecuted by jealous colleagues and bound by the rigid structures of academia. Zane, already in awe of Evelyn's intellect, found himself drawn deeper into her world. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who truly understood the artist's struggle. When Evelyn's hand brushed against his, the electric charge between them was undeniable. What happened next would be a point of contention in the later investigation. Evelyn claimed that Zane initiated the kiss, overcome by youthful passion. Zane, in his final statement, insisted that Evelyn had orchestrated the entire evening to this end. Regardless of who made the first move, that night marked the beginning of a physical relationship that would have devastating consequences. As the new semester began, Evelyn and Zane's secret affair intensified. Clandestine meetings in her office turned into long weekends at secluded bed and breakfasts. Evelyn showered Zane with gifts: rare books, expensive pens, a laptop to replace his outdated model. She framed each gift as an investment in his future as a writer, further binding him to her. Zane's grades, which had been middling in his other classes, suddenly skyrocketed. Evelyn used her influence to intervene on his behalf with other professors, painting him as a misunderstood genius who simply needed the right guidance. She promised Zane that with her help, he could secure a spot in a prestigious MFA program, bypassing the usual requirements. But as Zane's dependence on Evelyn grew, so did his anxiety. The initial thrill of their forbidden romance began to give way to guilt and fear of discovery. His writing, once vibrant and unique, became a pale imitation of Evelyn's style. His few remaining friends noticed his increasing isolation and erratic behavior. Evelyn, sensing Zane's unease, doubled down on her manipulation. She alternated between lavish praise and cruel criticism, keeping Zane in a constant state of emotional turmoil. She convinced him that their relationship was special, a meeting of twin souls that the ordinary world could never understand. In a particularly chilling move, Evelyn began to insinuate that Zane's success was entirely dependent on her goodwill. During one tense encounter in her office, she casually remarked, "It would be a shame if the ethics board were to investigate the sudden improvement in your grades. They might get the wrong idea about how you've been earning them." The implied threat was clear. Zane, trapped between his ambition and his growing sense of moral unease, began to withdraw into himself. His journal entries from this period, later recovered by investigators, paint a picture of a young man in deep emotional distress. February 15th, "I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I've achieved feels tainted. But how can something so wrong feel so necessary?" March 3rd, "E says she's the only one who truly understands me. Maybe she's right." The thought of losing her terrifies me more than anything. As spring bloomed on the Briarcliff campus, the web of lies and manipulation had grown so thick that Zane could scarcely remember his life before Evelyn, his family, worried by his increasingly infrequent calls home, planned a surprise visit. Evelyn, paranoid about discovery, forced Zane to rebuff them, causing a painful rift. It was during this time that Zane began to confide in his roommate, Trevor. While he didn't reveal the full extent of his relationship with Evelyn, he shared enough for Trevor to become deeply concerned. Trevor's worried glances and pointed questions about Zane's relationship with Dr. Gosling would later prove to be the thread that would begin to unravel the whole sordid affair. As the semester neared its end, the pressure on both Evelyn and Zane intensified. Their relationship, built on a foundation of manipulation and false promises, was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Neither could have predicted the violent culmination that lay just around the corner, a tragic end to a romance that should never have begun. The catalyst for the tragic events that followed came in the form of a seemingly innocuous email. Dr. Fiona Sullivan, the Dean of Liberal Arts, reached out to Evelyn about Zane's remarkable academic turnaround, expressing interest in featuring him in a college newsletter. For Evelyn, this well-intentioned inquiry set off alarm bells. The thought of increased scrutiny on Zane's achievements filled her with panic. In a frenzy, Evelyn called Zane to her office after hours. The tension was palpable as she paced the room, outlining the danger they were in. Zane, already worn down by months of emotional manipulation, felt the last vestiges of his self-worth crumbling. It was in this charged atmosphere that Zane finally found the courage to confront the reality of their situation. His voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This isn't right, Evelyn. What we're doing is destroying me." Evelyn's reaction was swift and cruel. Her nurturing facade cracked, revealing the ruthless manipulator beneath. She reminded Zane of all she had done for him, how his success was entirely due to her influence. In a chilling moment, she asked, "Do you really think you'd be anything without me? You're nothing but a small-town boy with delusions of grandeur. I made you." Zane, his eyes open to the toxic nature of their relationship, felt a surge of anger and self-preservation. He shot back, "This ends now. I'm going to tell the dean everything." The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her carefully constructed world teetered on the brink of collapse. In a last-ditch effort to maintain control, she alternated between threats and pleas, reminding Zane of the consequences they would both face if the truth came to light. But something had shifted in Zane. The fog of infatuation and manipulation had lifted, revealing the stark reality of his situation. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, when Evelyn's voice, now ice-cold, stopped him. "If you walk out that door, I'll make sure you never write again." Zane paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, without turning back, he walked out, leaving Evelyn alone with the ruins of her twisted fantasy. The following days were a blur for both Zane and Evelyn. Zane, emboldened by his decision, confided the full extent of the affair to his roommate Trevor. Together, they decided to approach Dean Sullivan with the truth. Evelyn, meanwhile, spiraled into panic. She alternated between desperate attempts to contact Zane and frantic efforts to cover her tracks. She deleted emails, shredded documents, and called in favors from colleagues to vouch for her character. As Zane prepared to meet with the dean, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Evelyn's threats echoed in his mind, but he was determined to reclaim his life and his integrity. Little did he know that Evelyn, driven to the brink by the imminent exposure of her crimes, was formulating a desperate and deadly plan to silence him forever. On the night of the murder, Zane Holloway left the library just after midnight, his mind preoccupied with the meeting he had scheduled with Dean Sullivan the following morning. As he walked along the deserted path that skirted the lake, he failed to notice the figure emerging from the shadows behind him. Evelyn Gosling had spent the day in a state of frenzied planning. Her rational mind had been overwhelmed by a toxic mix of fear, rage, and desperation. In her distorted reality, silencing Zane had become the only way to preserve the life she had built. She had waited for hours, watching the library entrance, a large rock clutched in her trembling hands. As Zane approached a secluded bend in the path, Evelyn made her move. The first blow caught Zane by surprise, sending him stumbling forward. He turned, shock and betrayal etched on his face as he recognized his attacker. "Evelyn, I trusted you," he gasped. But Evelyn was beyond reason. With a strength born of desperation, with a rock in her hand, she struck again and again while he was on the ground. Zane's attempts to defend himself were weakened by his reluctance to hurt the woman he had once admired and loved. In the aftermath of her violent act, Evelyn stood frozen, the reality of what she had done crashing over her. The fog seemed to close in, muffling the sound of Zane's body as it slid down the embankment into the dark waters of the lake. With mechanical efficiency, Evelyn began to cover her tracks. She gathered Zane's scattered belongings, wiping them clean of fingerprints before tossing them into the water. She scoured the area for any evidence that might link her to the scene. As the first light of dawn began to break through the mist, Evelyn made her way back to her apartment, her clothes sodden and muddied. Over the next few days, Evelyn attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. She taught her classes, attended faculty meetings, all while battling the internal chaos of her guilt and fear. When Zane was reported missing, she feigned concern, even joining search parties organized by the college. But the weight of her actions took its toll. Colleagues noted her distracted demeanor and uncharacteristic nervousness. A psychology professor who had known Evelyn for years later recalled, "There was a wildness in her eyes, a tension in her movements. It was as if she was constantly on the verge of flight." Evelyn's carefully constructed alibi began to unravel almost immediately. The rock she had used as a weapon, hastily discarded in the dumpster behind her apartment building, was discovered by a maintenance worker. Security camera footage placed her car near the lake on the night of Zane's disappearance, contradicting her claim of being home all night. As the investigation intensified, Evelyn's paranoia reached new heights. She became convinced that everyone knew her secret. In a moment of panic, she attempted to flee, hastily packing a bag and withdrawing large sums of cash from her bank account. It was this erratic behavior that ultimately led to her undoing. Zane's body, weighed down by rocks, was discovered by a group of students on a weekend fishing trip. The grim discovery sent shockwaves through the Briarcliff community and marked the beginning of the end for Evelyn Gosling. The discovery of Zane Holloway's body transformed the missing person case into a full-blown homicide investigation. Detective Samantha Reeves, a veteran of the Briarcliff Police Department, took charge of the case. Her first steps were to secure the crime scene and order a comprehensive forensic analysis of the area surrounding Lake Briarcliff. The autopsy revealed that Zane had died from blunt force trauma to the head, with drowning as a secondary cause of death. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds on Zane's arms, indicating he had tried to protect himself from his attacker. As news of the murder spread, the idyllic campus of Briarcliff Community College became a hotbed of speculation and fear. Students whispered in hallways, casting suspicious glances at their peers and professors. The administration, desperate to control the narrative, held conferences assuring parents and the community that this was an isolated incident. Detective Reeves and her team began the painstaking process of interviewing Zane's friends, family, and associates. It was during these initial interviews that Zane's roommate, Trevor Lawson, provided the first crucial lead. Trevor revealed Zane's troubled relationship with Professor Gosling, including vague references to an arrangement that had left Zane increasingly distressed in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. This information led investigators to take a closer look at Evelyn Gosling. On the surface, she appeared to be a grieving mentor, distraught over the loss of a promising student. However, as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. A breakthrough came when forensic analysts discovered traces of soil on the rock used to attack Zane that matched samples from Evelyn's garden. Additionally, security footage from a gas station near Lake Briarcliff showed Evelyn's car in the area on the night of the murder, contradicting her alibi. As the evidence mounted, Evelyn's colleagues began to come forward with their own observations. A professor from the psychology department recalled a disturbing conversation with Evelyn just days before Zane's disappearance. She seemed agitated, he told investigators. She kept talking about how she couldn't let everything she'd worked for be destroyed by a misunderstanding. The investigation took another turn when detectives uncovered a series of emails between Evelyn and Zane. While carefully worded, the subtext of these messages hinted at an inappropriate relationship. IT specialists recovered deleted drafts of emails from Evelyn's college account that were far more explicit, detailing her manipulation of Zane and her fears of exposure. The search of Evelyn's apartment yielded damning evidence. Hidden in a locked drawer, detectives found Zane's journal, which detailed the evolution of their relationship and his growing desire to end it. With the wealth of physical evidence and witness testimony, the district attorney's office felt confident in charging Evelyn Gosling with first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, shattering the image of the brilliant, dedicated professor and exposing the dark underbelly of power dynamics in academia. As Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, the true scope of her deception began to unravel, leaving the Briarcliff community to grapple with the question of how such a predator had hidden in plain sight for so long. Over the next several hours, Evelyn's full confession emerged, painting a disturbing picture of manipulation, abuse of power, and ultimately, murder. She spoke of her initial attraction to Zane's talent and vulnerability, how easy it had been to shape him to her will. Her voice filled with bitterness as she recounted Zane's decision to expose their relationship, describing it as a betrayal that left her no option but to silence him permanently. The trial of Evelyn Gosling was brief but intense. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, from forensic analysis to Evelyn's own confession. Despite a vigorous defense attempting to paint her as a victim of her own mental illness, the jury took only 6 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, her voice heavy with the weight of the moment, sentenced Evelyn to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of the trial saw significant changes at Briarcliff Community College. The administration implemented strict new guidelines governing faculty-student interactions, and mandatory training on recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior was instituted. As Briarcliff slowly began to heal, the tragedy left an indelible mark on the community. The shores of Lake Briarcliff, once a place of tranquility and reflection, now stood as a somber reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most respectable facades, and the tragic consequences when trust is abused and power is unchecked. One early autumn morning, the lifeless body of Melissa Porter was discovered in her car, parked on a secluded road just outside town. Felissa, a local kindergarten teacher beloved by many, had gone missing 2 days prior, leaving behind a worried husband and a community in shock. James Porter, Melissa's husband, was the first to report her missing. James, a mild-mannered accountant, had been frantic with worry, his anxiety evident in the tremor of his voice when he spoke to the police. The discovery of Melissa's body turned his worst fears into a nightmarish reality. Alongside James, 2 other men, Michael Reynolds and Joe Clark, soon came under the scrutiny of the investigation. Both had been intimately involved with Melissa, each harboring deep and complex feelings for her. Detective Sarah Davis, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and an unyielding determination for justice, was assigned to the case. As she delved into Melissa's life and the relationships that entwined her with James, Michael, and Joe, it became clear that beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward case lay a labyrinth of secrets and betrayals. The story of Melissa Porter's demise was not just a tale of a tragic death, but of a tangled web of love, deceit, and vengeance. It was a crisp morning when Officer Tom Harris received a call about an abandoned vehicle on the outskirts of Oakwood. As he approached the scene, the sight of Melissa Porter's car sent a chill down his spine. The car was parked haphazardly, one wheel on the gravel shoulder, the other on the grassy verge. The windows were fogged, and the faintest hint of a foul odor wafted through the air. Harris peered through the driver's window and recoiled. Melissa Porter was slumped over the steering wheel. Her skin was pallid, and a faint trickle of blood had dried on her temple. The immediate cause of death was not apparent, but the scene suggested foul play. The small community of Oakwood buzzed with shock and sorrow as news of the discovery spread. Melissa had been missing for 48 hours, and her friends and family had clung to hope that she would return unharmed. Now that hope was cruelly dashed. James Porter was inconsolable, his grief magnified by the public scrutiny he now faced. He had been the one to report Melissa missing, and now he was thrust into the center of a murder investigation. Detective Sarah Davis arrived at the scene, her expression grim. She meticulously inspected the car and the surrounding area, noting the lack of defensive wounds on Melissa's body and the absence of a struggle. This suggested she might have been unconscious or incapacitated before her death. A preliminary examination revealed traces of a powdery substance on the passenger seat, which would later be identified as a potent sedative. Davis ordered the car to be towed to the forensic lab for a thorough examination and instructed her team to canvass the area for witnesses. The investigation had just begun, but the pressure to find answers was immense. The community wanted justice for Melissa, and the police were determined to provide it. The Oakwood Police Department quickly mobilized to investigate Melissa Porter's death. Detective Davis spearheaded the effort, her no-nonsense attitude setting the tone for the team. The first order of business was to question James Porter, whose proximity to the victim made him an initial person of interest. James was brought in for questioning at the station. He looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. Detective Davis began with routine questions about his relationship with Melissa, their recent activities, and his whereabouts during the time she was missing. James explained that he and Melissa had been married for 5 years, a seemingly happy couple in the eyes of the community. He recounted the night Melissa disappeared. She had left the house around 7 p.m., claiming she needed to run some errands. When she didn't return, he grew worried and called the police the next morning. Davis noted his demeanor, searching for signs of deception. James provided an alibi, stating he was home watching TV that night. He offered to let the police verify his story with their home security system's footage. Davis made a mental note to follow up on this lead. As the interview progressed, another name surfaced: Michael Reynolds. According to James, Michael was a close friend of Melissa's, someone she had known for years. James admitted he had always felt a bit uneasy about their relationship, but had no concrete reason to suspect anything untoward. Detective Davis decided to pay Michael a visit. Michael Reynolds, a tall man in his early 30s with an air of easy confidence, welcomed the detectives into his home. He seemed genuinely distraught upon hearing of Melissa's death, insisting they had been just friends. However, his nervous fidgeting suggested there might be more to the story. The investigation widened to include Joe Clark, a local artist who had been seen with Melissa on numerous occasions. Joe, in his mid-40s, was known for his brooding temperament and reclusive lifestyle. He was less forthcoming than Michael, evading direct questions and offering vague, cryptic responses. Detective Davis sensed that both Michael and Joe were hiding something. The threads of Melissa's life began to unravel, revealing a woman who was far more complex and enigmatic than anyone had realized. With each interview, the investigation grew more convoluted, and the stakes became higher. The truth about Melissa's death was buried beneath layers of secrets, and it was up to Davis to dig them out. Melissa Porter was born and raised in Oakwood, a town she loved and never wanted to leave. She was known for her warm smile and her ability to connect with people, traits that made her an excellent kindergarten teacher. Her marriage to James was seen as a match made in heaven, though those closest to her knew there was more beneath the surface. Melissa met James at a charity event 5 years ago. James, an accountant with a stable job and a kind heart, seemed like the perfect partner. They married within a year, and for a while their life together appeared idyllic. But over time, Melissa began to feel restless. The routine of married life left her yearning for something more. Enter Michael Reynolds. Michael and Melissa had been friends since high school. Their bond had always been strong, and there were times when their friendship seemed to border on something deeper. Michael, a charming and successful entrepreneur, offered Melissa the excitement and passion she felt was missing from her marriage. Their relationship, while initially platonic, soon evolved into a secret affair. Melissa found herself torn between the security James provided and the thrill she experienced with Michael. Her feelings for Michael were intense, but they also brought complications and guilt. Then there was Joe Clark. Joe was a local artist, known for his moody paintings and reclusive nature. Melissa met Joe at an art exhibition a year before her death. Joe was different from both James and Michael. He was mysterious and brooding, qualities that fascinated Melissa. Their connection was immediate, and it wasn't long before Melissa found herself involved with Joe as well. Melissa's relationships with Michael and Joe were known only to a few close friends, and she took great pains to keep them hidden from James. However, managing these affairs became increasingly difficult, and Melissa's life grew more complicated. She loved each of these men in different ways, and each offered her something unique. But she also knew that this web of love and deceit could not last forever. As Detective Davis delved deeper into Melissa's background, she discovered a woman who was passionate and vibrant but also deeply conflicted. Melissa's need for connection and excitement had led her down a dangerous path, one that ultimately ended in her untimely death. With Melissa's body discovered and her secret life beginning to surface, suspicion naturally fell on James Porter. Detective Davis scrutinized his alibi, seeking any inconsistencies that might indicate his involvement in his wife's death. James's alibi rested on his claim that he was at home the night Melissa disappeared, watching TV, and later falling asleep on the couch. The home security footage confirmed that James had not left the house during the critical hours. However, Davis was not entirely convinced. She knew that alibis could be fabricated or manipulated. The state of the Porters' marriage became a focal point of the investigation. Friends and neighbors painted a picture of a couple that appeared happy, but had their share of issues. Financial records showed that the Porters were struggling with debt, a potential motive for James to want his wife out of the picture. Life insurance policies on Melissa further added to the suspicion. Though the amounts were not exorbitant, James's demeanor during questioning was another point of concern. While his grief seemed genuine, there were moments when his responses were too measured, too controlled. Davis wondered if he was hiding something, or simply trying to protect himself from being wrongfully accused. The most damning piece of evidence was a series of text messages exchanged between James and Melissa in the days leading up to her disappearance. The messages revealed growing tension between them, with Melissa expressing dissatisfaction and James responding with frustration. The arguments, though not overtly violent, indicated a marriage under significant strain. James's interactions with Michael and Joe also raised red flags. Both men admitted to having confrontations with James, who had become increasingly suspicious of their relationships with Melissa. James denied any knowledge of Melissa's affairs, but his anger towards the men was palpable. As the investigation progressed, James Porter remained a prime suspect. His potential motives, financial gain, marital discord, and jealousy, provided enough cause for Detective Davis to keep a close watch on him. However, without concrete evidence linking him directly to the crime, the case against him remained circumstantial. Michael Reynolds and Joe Clark, the two men who had shared intimate relationships with Melissa, were next on Detective Davis's list. Each had their own reasons for wanting Melissa in their lives, and potentially reasons for wanting her gone. Michael Reynolds, with his charismatic demeanor and successful career, seemed an unlikely suspect at first glance. He had been Melissa's confidant for years, their bond evolving into a romantic relationship that brought both joy and complications. Michael's feelings for Melissa were genuine, but his frustration with her indecision and the secrecy of their affair had caused tension. During questioning, Michael admitted to feeling hurt and betrayed when he discovered Melissa's involvement with Joe, but he vehemently denied having anything to do with her death. Joe Clark was a different story. Known for his brooding personality and artistic temperament, Joe had always been somewhat of an enigma. His relationship with Melissa was intense and passionate, but also fraught with jealousy and possessiveness. Joe's art often reflected his tumultuous emotions, and his interactions with Melissa had been no exception. During his interview, Joe was evasive, his answers tinged with bitterness. He expressed deep sorrow over Melissa's death, but also a lingering resentment towards her for being unable to fully commit to him. Davis noted the contrasts between Michael and Joe. One a polished, successful businessman, the other a moody, introspective artist. Both had motives driven by love and jealousy, and both had been deeply affected by Melissa's actions. The detective also discovered that Michael and Joe had confronted each other on several occasions, their arguments escalating as Melissa's relationships with them became more entangled. The investigation into Michael and Joe's backgrounds revealed more layers to Melissa's story. Each man had been drawn to Melissa's vivacious personality and warmth, but both had also experienced the darker sides of their relationships with her. The complexity of these relationships suggested that Melissa's death was not a straightforward case of jealousy or revenge, but rather a culmination of many conflicting emotions and desires. As Detective Davis continued to unravel the intricacies of Melissa's life and relationships, she realized that the truth was buried deep within a web of passion, betrayal, and hidden motives. The challenge was to untangle these threads and find the one that would lead to Melissa's killer. As Detective Davis dug deeper into the lives of Melissa, James, Michael, and Joe, she began to uncover a series of startling revelations and secrets that painted a clearer picture of Melissa's complex world. The first major revelation came from Melissa's close friend, Laura Mitchell. Laura revealed that Melissa had been confiding in her for months about the struggles in her marriage and the turmoil caused by her relationships with Michael and Joe. Melissa had been feeling increasingly trapped and overwhelmed by the dual pressures of maintaining her marriage and managing her affairs. Laura also mentioned that Melissa had expressed fears about someone stalking her, though she never specified who. This new information prompted Davis to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. The possibility of a third-party involvement, someone who knew about Melissa's affairs and had a vested interest in her demise, became a compelling angle. Davis ordered a deeper investigation into Melissa's communications and social media, looking for any signs of threats or suspicious activity. The forensic analysis of Melissa's car provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Traces of the sedative found in the passenger seat matched a prescription registered to Joe Clark. When confronted with this evidence, Joe's calm facade began to crack. He admitted to having the sedative, but claimed he had no intention of harming Melissa. According to Joe, Melissa had asked him for the sedative to help her sleep, a claim that was difficult to verify. Further complicating the investigation was a discovery in Michael's financial records. Large sums of money had been transferred between Michael's accounts and an unknown third party over the past few months. Michael explained that these were business transactions, but the lack of clear documentation raised suspicion. Davis wondered if Michael might have been involved in some form of blackmail or had hired someone to intimidate Melissa. The pressure on all three men intensified as Davis continued to piece together Melissa's last days. Interviews with neighbors and colleagues revealed that Melissa had been planning to leave Oakwood, possibly to escape the tangled relationships she had found herself in. She had been seen packing boxes into her car and had mentioned to a colleague that she needed a fresh start. Then came the biggest revelation of all: a hidden journal found in Melissa's belongings. The journal contained detailed accounts of her relationships with James, Michael, and Joe, as well as her fears and plans for the future. Melissa wrote about feeling suffocated by James's controlling nature, exhilarated by her affair with Michael, and deeply conflicted about her intense connection with Joe. She also mentioned receiving anonymous threats, which she suspected were from someone who knew about her affairs. The journal painted a picture of a woman caught in a web of her own making, desperate to break free but unsure how. It provided Detective Davis with critical insights into Melissa's state of mind and the potential motives of those around her. With this new evidence, Davis felt she was finally closing in on the truth. Just as Detective Davis thought she was getting closer to solving the case, a surprising twist emerged that shifted the focus of the investigation. A new piece of evidence surfaced: a security camera recording from a nearby convenience store that showed Melissa in the company of a man who was neither James, Michael, nor Joe on the night she disappeared. The man in the footage was identified as Daniel Harper, a former colleague of Melissa's from a previous job in a neighboring town. Harper had a checkered past, including a history of violent behavior and a restraining order filed against him by a former girlfriend. The discovery of his involvement with Melissa added a new layer of complexity to the case. Davis brought Harper in for questioning. Harper, a wiry man with a nervous energy, initially denied having seen Melissa recently. However, when confronted with the video evidence, he changed his story. He admitted to meeting Melissa that night, but claimed they had only talked. According to Harper, Melissa had reached out to him because she felt threatened and needed someone to confide in. She had asked Harper to meet her away from Oakwood to avoid being seen by anyone who might know her. Harper's account seemed plausible, but Davis was wary. Harper had a motive: his unrequited feelings for Melissa and his jealousy over her relationships with other men. His past behavior suggested he could be capable of violence, especially if he felt rejected or betrayed. Davis decided to dig deeper into Harper's background and his interactions with Melissa. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of Harper's car revealed traces of the same sedative found in Melissa's vehicle. This new evidence linked Harper directly to the scene of the crime, making him a prime suspect. Harper's story began to unravel under the weight of mounting evidence. He confessed that he had given Melissa the sedative, but insisted it was for her own protection, claiming she had asked for it to calm her nerves. Detective Davis knew that Harper's involvement complicated the narrative, but she also suspected there was more to the story. Harper's account of events didn't entirely align with the evidence. Davis hypothesized that Harper might have been manipulated by someone else, possibly Michael or Joe, to carry out the crime. The idea of a larger conspiracy began to take shape. As Davis continued to press Harper for details, he revealed a startling detail. He had been receiving anonymous payments over the past few months, just like Michael. Harper claimed he didn't know who was behind the payments, but admitted they were meant to ensure his silence about his meetings with Melissa. This revelation pointed to a coordinated effort to keep Melissa's secrets hidden. Davis realized that the investigation had taken a dark turn, one that involved not just a crime of passion, but a calculated plan to silence Melissa permanently. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, and Davis was determined to uncover the mastermind behind the plot. The investigation took a sinister turn as Detective Davis unraveled the web of deception surrounding Melissa's death. The revelation of anonymous payments and Harper's involvement hinted at a larger, more nefarious plot. Davis now had to consider the possibility that Melissa's death was not just a crime of passion, but a premeditated murder orchestrated by someone with a hidden agenda. Davis's team focused on tracing the source of the payments. Financial records showed a series of transactions funneled through a shell company, eventually leading to an offshore account. The intricate financial trail suggested a high level of planning and resourcefulness, characteristics not typically associated with crimes of passion. This new lead pointed towards someone with significant financial acumen and the means to cover their tracks, potentially Michael Reynolds, given his business background. Davis revisited Michael, armed with the new evidence. Under intense questioning, Michael's confident facade began to crack. He admitted to transferring money to Harper, but insisted it was to help Melissa, not harm her. He claimed Melissa had confided in him about her fears and asked him to arrange for protection, but he had no idea Harper would misuse the funds. Davis was not convinced by Michael's explanation. She suspected that Michael, feeling cornered by Melissa's indecision and the threat of their affair being exposed, had orchestrated a plan to remove her from the equation. However, Michael alone could not have executed such a complex scheme. The involvement of Joe Clark, with his volatile emotions and connection to Melissa, seemed likely. Confronting Joe, Davis presented the evidence of the sedative and the financial transactions. Joe, already unstable, broke down under the pressure. He confessed to being manipulated by Michael, who had convinced him that Melissa was planning to leave both of them and expose their affairs. In a desperate bid to prevent this, Joe agreed to Michael's plan to sedate Melissa and make her disappear. The dark truth emerged. Michael had orchestrated the entire plot, using Joe and Harper as pawns to carry out his plan. Michael's motive was not just jealousy, but a calculated decision to eliminate Melissa and protect his reputation and business interests. Joe, driven by his emotional turmoil, had been an unwitting accomplice, and Harper, lured by money, had played his part without fully understanding the consequences. Davis's investigation had uncovered a chilling conspiracy that highlighted the lengths people would go to protect their secrets and desires. The case was far more complex and darker than anyone had initially imagined, revealing the depths of human deceit and treachery. With the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, Detective Davis moved swiftly to secure arrest warrants for Michael Reynolds and Joe Clark. The evidence against them was overwhelming: financial transactions, confessions, and the forensic link between the sedative and Joe. Davis coordinated with her team to ensure that the arrests were conducted smoothly and without incident. Joe Clark was the first to be apprehended. He was found at his studio, surrounded by his hauntingly dark paintings. The arresting officers found him in a state of disarray, his guilt and regret evident. Joe offered no resistance, murmuring apologies and asking about Melissa's final moments. His remorse was genuine, but it could not absolve him of his role in the crime. Michael Reynolds proved more challenging. He had anticipated the arrest and attempted to flee. However, a coordinated effort by the Oakwood Police Department ensured he was apprehended at a private airstrip, trying to board a chartered plane. His arrest was marked by defiance and indignation, maintaining his innocence and accusing the police of fabricating evidence. With both suspects in custody, the prosecution began to build a robust case. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational in Oakwood's history, drawing intense media attention. The courtroom was packed with townspeople, journalists, and those who had known Melissa. The prosecution presented a compelling narrative of manipulation, betrayal, and murder, while the defense tried to paint Michael as a victim of circumstance and Joe as a man driven to desperation. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the extensive evidence and emotional testimonies. Ultimately, both Michael Reynolds and Joe Clark were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and second-degree murder. Michael received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while Joe, whose genuine remorse and cooperation were considered, was given a reduced sentence of 25 years. Daniel Harper, whose role was more peripheral, was charged with accessory to murder and received a lesser sentence of 10 years. His involvement, though significant, was viewed as being coerced by the primary conspirators. In the end, Oakwood returned to its peaceful existence, but the memory of Melissa Porter and the lessons learned from her case would never be forgotten. Her story remained a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring quest for truth and justice. On a crisp autumn morning in 2019, the body of Samantha Davenport was discovered in the basement of her modest suburban home, the victim of a brutal and ritualistic murder. At the center of this horrifying tale was Josh Davenport, a 48-year-old insurance adjuster whose unremarkable life belied the shocking acts he would eventually commit. To his neighbors, Josh was a quiet, somewhat awkward man who kept to himself. Few could have imagined the turmoil brewing beneath his placid exterior, or the sinister forces that would ultimately drive him to murder. Josh Davenport's journey to becoming a murderer began long before he ever logged onto the dark web. Born in 1971 to working-class parents, Josh was a shy and introverted child who struggled to form meaningful connections with his peers. His father, a stern factory worker, showed little affection and often berated Josh for his lack of athletic prowess and social skills. His mother, though loving, was overwhelmed by her own struggles with depression and was unable to provide the emotional support Josh desperately needed. Throughout his school years, Josh found solace in books and computers, excelling academically but failing to develop the social skills necessary to navigate the complexities of human relationships. He graduated high school with honors, but opted to attend the local community college, rather than venturing away from the familiar confines of his town. It was during his college years that Josh experienced his first taste of romantic connection. Samantha, a kind-hearted nursing student, saw past Josh's awkward exterior and was drawn to his intelligence and quiet sensitivity. Their relationship blossomed, and for a time Josh believed he had found the acceptance and love he had always craved. After graduation, Josh secured a job as an insurance adjuster at a local firm, while Samantha began her career as a registered nurse at a general hospital. They married in 1996, settling into a modest home not far from where Josh had grown up. For the first few years, their life together seemed idyllic, but cracks soon began to appear in their relationship. Josh's innate insecurity and fear of abandonment manifested as jealousy and possessiveness. He grew increasingly paranoid about Samantha's interactions with male colleagues and patients, often accusing her of infidelity without cause. Samantha, in turn, became frustrated with Josh's lack of emotional maturity and his inability to trust her. Their arguments grew more frequent and intense, driving a wedge between them that widened with each passing year. As he approached middle age, Josh found himself grappling with a profound sense of disappointment and failure. His career had stagnated, with younger colleagues passing him by for promotions. The dream of starting a family had long since faded, as fertility issues and the strain on their marriage made parenthood an increasingly distant possibility. By his mid-40s, Josh had become a shell of his former self. He went through the motions at work, returning home each evening to a house filled with tension and unspoken resentment. Samantha had grown distant, throwing herself into her career and volunteer work, leaving Josh to confront his loneliness and sense of inadequacy and solitude. It was in this state of desperation and vulnerability that Josh first turned to the internet as a means of escape. What began as harmless browsing of forums and chat rooms gradually led him to explore darker corners of the web, searching for anything to fill the void that had consumed his life. Little did he know that this digital journey would lead him to the doorstep of a group that would exploit his weaknesses and set him on a path to unimaginable darkness. Josh's descent into the world of the dark web began innocuously enough. Late one night, unable to sleep and desperate for some form of human connection, he found himself browsing online forums dedicated to topics ranging from conspiracy theories to the occult. These digital spaces offered Josh a sense of anonymity and acceptance he had never experienced in his day-to-day life. As he delved deeper into these online communities, Josh encountered mentions of the dark web, a hidden part of the internet, accessible only through specialized software. Initially, Josh's forays into the dark web were driven by curiosity rather than malice. He marveled at the vast array of information and services available, both legal and illegal. Josh's exploration of the dark web coincided with a particularly difficult period in his marriage. Samantha had recently received a promotion at work, which only served to highlight Josh's own career stagnation. Their arguments had become more frequent and bitter, often ending with Samantha sleeping in the spare bedroom. The dark web became Josh's refuge, a place where he could escape the failures and disappointments of his real life. It was during one of his late-night browsing sessions that Josh stumbled upon a forum. The site's black background and crimson text created an aura of mystery and danger that immediately captivated Josh. As he read through the posts, he found discussions of ancient rituals, dark powers, and the promise of transformation for those deemed worthy. Something about the forum's blend of occult knowledge and promises of personal empowerment resonated deeply with Josh. Here was a group that seemed to offer the sense of purpose and belonging he had craved his entire life. Despite a faint voice of caution in the back of his mind, Josh created an account and made his first post, introducing himself as a seeker of hidden truths. The response was almost immediate. Within minutes, Josh received welcoming messages from other members, each more effusive than the last. As he basked in this sudden attention and acceptance, Josh failed to recognize the predatory nature of the interest being shown in him. He had taken his first step into a world that would ultimately consume him, setting in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy and horror. The forum was far more than just another dark web cult. It was a carefully constructed digital ecosystem designed to identify, manipulate, and exploit vulnerable individuals like Josh Davenport. At its core, the group presented itself as a modern mystery cult, blending elements of ancient paganism, satanic imagery, and New Age spirituality into a seductive tapestry of esoteric knowledge and promised power. The forum's structure was deceptively simple at first glance. New members like Josh started in the outer circle, known as the Seekers. Here they were encouraged to share their personal struggles and desires, all under the guise of seeking spiritual guidance. More experienced members, called Guides, would respond with carefully crafted messages of support and understanding, gradually introducing the group's core beliefs and practices. As Seekers proved their dedication through active participation and completion of assigned spiritual exercises, they could progress to the rank of Initiate. This inner circle had access to more specialized sub-forums and one-on-one mentoring sessions with higher-ranking members. It was at this level that the true nature of the cult began to reveal itself, with discussions of blood rituals, sacrificial magic, and the accumulation of dark energies. At the pinnacle of the dark forum stood the enigmatic figure known only as the Crimson Prophet. This individual, whose true identity remained a closely guarded secret, was revered by cult members as a direct conduit to ancient and powerful dark forces. The Crimson Prophet's posts were rare but always impactful, written in a cryptic style that invited multiple interpretations and sparked fierce debates among the followers. Key members of the cult played specific roles in the indoctrination and manipulation of newcomers like Josh. There was Midnight Whisper, a self-proclaimed empath who excelled at identifying and exploiting emotional vulnerabilities. Darksage served as the group's lore master, weaving together mythologies and occult traditions to create a compelling narrative of secret knowledge. Shadowwalker acted as the cult's enforcer, subtly threatening those who showed signs of doubt or resistance. The beliefs propagated by the cult of the forum were a toxic blend of fatalism, elitism, and promised salvation through darkness. Members were taught that the world was inherently corrupt and that true power could only be achieved by embracing humanity's darkest impulses. The cult preached that certain individuals, their followers, were chosen by dark forces to bring about a new age of chaos and transformation. Rituals played a central role in the cult's practices. These began as seemingly harmless meditation exercises and symbolic gestures performed in front of webcams. However, as members progressed through the ranks, the rituals became increasingly extreme, often involving self-harm, sexual degradation, and eventually, acts of violence against others. Financial exploitation was another key aspect of the cult's operations. Members were encouraged to make offerings to prove their dedication, with higher ranks requiring ever larger financial commitments. As Josh Davenport delved deeper into the cult, he remained unaware of the full scope of the organization he had joined. Josh's progression from seeker to initiate was rapid, fueled by his desperate need for acceptance and his willingness to embrace the cult's teachings. He eagerly completed each assigned task, from meditation exercises focused on channeling dark energies to more disturbing activities like recording himself reciting blasphemous oaths in front of a makeshift altar. As Josh delved deeper into the cult's ideology, his behavior in the real world began to change noticeably. He grew more withdrawn at work, his performance slipping to the point where he received a formal warning from his supervisor. At home, the distance between him and Samantha widened into an unbridgeable chasm. When she attempted to discuss her concerns about his changed demeanor, Josh reacted with uncharacteristic anger, accusing her of trying to hold him back from his true potential. The rituals Josh performed grew increasingly extreme. What began as simple candle-lighting ceremonies evolved into bloodletting rituals, with Josh using a ceremonial dagger, provided by the cult, to make small cuts on his arms and chest. He meticulously documented these acts, sharing the images with his online mentors who praised his dedication and promised that greater power awaited him. Josh's physical appearance began to deteriorate as he neglected his health in favor of spending more time online. He lost weight. His skin took on a pallid hue and dark circles formed under his eyes from countless nights spent hunched over his computer screen. Samantha's pleas for him to seek help fell on deaf ears, as Josh convinced himself that she simply couldn't understand the profound transformation he was undergoing. As Josh progressed through the ranks of the cult, he was granted access to more exclusive areas of the forum. Here, he encountered discussions of even darker practices, including animal sacrifice and the harnessing of sexual energy for magical purposes. The turning point came when Josh was selected for a one-on-one digital audience with the Crimson Prophet. This rare honor filled Josh with a sense of pride and purpose he hadn't felt in years. As he sat before his computer, heart racing in anticipation, Josh felt that he was on the verge of unlocking the secrets of the universe. He had no way of knowing that this conversation would set in motion a series of events that would lead to tragedy and the destruction of everything he had ever known. The digital audience with the Crimson Prophet marked a critical juncture in Josh's descent into darkness. The encounter was carefully orchestrated to maximize its psychological impact, with Josh instructed to prepare his sacred space, don ceremonial robes, and engage in a preparatory ritual involving meditation and self-flagellation. "The prophet, you have been chosen," the message began. "You stand at the threshold of true power, but the path forward requires the ultimate sacrifice. Are you prepared to shed the last vestiges of your former self and embrace the darkness that will set you free?" Josh's fingers trembled as he typed his response. "I am ready, great prophet. Tell me what I must do." What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. The Crimson Prophet began by reinforcing Josh's sense of specialness and destiny. They wove a narrative that recast Josh's life struggles as tests of worthiness, positioning him as a long-awaited messiah figure within the cult's mythology. The prophet then began to probe Josh's psyche, asking pointed questions about his relationships, particularly with Samantha. Josh, his inhibitions lowered by the intoxicating atmosphere of the encounter, poured out his frustrations and resentments. He spoke of feeling emasculated by Samantha's success, of the gnawing fear that she would leave him for someone better. With each confession, the prophet offered validation and twisted guidance. "Your wife is an anchor, holding you back from your true potential," the prophet declared. "She is a servant of the light, unconsciously working to suppress your growing power. As long as she lives, you can never fully embrace your destiny." The suggestion of violence was introduced gradually, cloaked in the language of ritual and sacrifice. The prophet spoke of ancient rites that required the offering of that which the aspirant held most dear. In Josh's case, the prophet asserted, this could only mean one thing: Samantha's life. By the end of the session, Josh's mind was reeling. The prophet left him with a set of detailed instructions for a ritual that would supposedly unleash his latent powers, a ritual that would culminate in Samantha's death. "Perform this rite, and you will be reborn as a living god," the prophet promised. Fail and you will be cast out, forever unworthy of the gifts that could have been yours. As the prophet's avatar faded from the screen, Josh sat in stunned silence, the full weight of what he was considering crashing down upon him. A small part of him recognized the madness of what he was contemplating, but that voice was quickly drowned out by the chorus of his own insecurities and the seductive whispers of promised power. The week leading up to the fateful night was a blur of feverish preparation and mounting tension for Josh. By day, he went through the motions of his normal life, his colleagues and even Samantha unaware of the storm raging within him. By night, he meticulously gathered the components for the ritual as specified by the Crimson Prophet. Black candles, a silver chalice, a ceremonial dagger with a bone handle, and various herbs and powders of dubious origin. As the designated date approached, Josh's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He barely slept, spending hours poring over the instructions he'd been given, memorizing the incantations and visualizing the act he was about to commit. Samantha, sensing the growing tension, made several attempts to reach out to Josh. She suggested counseling, tried to engage him in conversations about their future, and even planned a weekend getaway in a last-ditch effort to rekindle their connection. Josh rebuffed each overture, his mind already set on the grim task ahead. On the evening of October 15, 2019, Samantha Davenport returned home from her shift at the hospital, exhausted but looking forward to a quiet night with her husband. The house was dark as she entered, save for a faint flickering light emanating from the basement door. Samantha called out Josh's name, receiving no response. Concerned, she made her way down the basement stairs, unaware that she was walking into a nightmare. The scene that greeted Samantha was like something out of a horror film. The basement had been transformed into a macabre ritual space. Flat candles formed a large circle in the center of the room, their flames casting writhing shadows on the walls. Strange symbols had been painted on the floor and walls, in what looked disturbingly like blood. In the center of the circle stood Josh, clad in a black robe, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Samantha, what are you doing here?" Josh's voice was barely recognizable, a hoarse whisper that sent chills down Samantha's spine. "You weren't supposed to be home yet. It's not time." Samantha, frozen in shock and fear, struggled to comprehend the scene before her. "Josh, what is all this? What's going on?" Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the man before her with the husband she thought she knew. Josh's demeanor shifted, a cruel smile playing across his lips. "You're early, my dear, but perhaps this is meant to be. The Dark Lords work in mysterious ways." He gestured for Samantha to enter the circle. "Come, join me, be part of my ascension." As Samantha took a hesitant step backward, Josh lunged forward with surprising speed. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and dragged her into the circle. Samantha's screams were cut short as Josh clamped a hand over her mouth, forcing her to the ground. What followed was a scene of unimaginable horror. Josh, lost in the throes of his delusion, began to recite the incantations he had so carefully memorized. His voice rose and fell in an unnatural cadence as he called upon dark forces that existed only in the twisted mythology of the cult. Samantha fought desperately, but Josh's madness lent him an inhuman strength. He bound her wrists and ankles with cord, heedless of her muffled pleas and tears. As he reached for the ceremonial dagger, a fleeting look of doubt crossed his face. For a moment, the man Samantha had married seemed to resurface, horror dawning in his eyes as he realized what he was about to do. But the moment passed, Josh's features hardened once more as he raised the dagger high. "This is my sacrifice," he intoned. "With this offering, I claim my power and break the chains of my old life." The dagger plunged down, and Samantha's body jerked as the blade pierced her chest. Josh, lost in a frenzy of bloodlust and religious ecstasy, stabbed again and again. As Samantha's life ebbed away, Josh continued the ritual. He collected her blood in the silver chalice, anointed his forehead with it, and chanted the final words of the ceremony. He waited, breathless for the rush of power the Crimson Prophet had promised. Seconds ticked by, then minutes, but nothing changed. The basement remained silent, save for Josh's ragged breathing and the soft hiss of guttering candles. Slowly, terribly, reality began to assert itself. The magnitude of what he had done crashed over Josh like a tidal wave. He looked down at his blood-soaked hands, at the lifeless body of the woman he had once vowed to love and protect, and a wail of anguish tore from his throat. There was no power, no transcendence, only the stark horror of his actions. Josh collapsed beside Samantha's body, cradling her cooling form as sobs racked his body. He remained there through the night, muttering incoherent apologies and pleas for forgiveness to unhearing ears. The discovery of Samantha Davenport's body sent shockwaves through the quiet community. It was the Davenports' next-door neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Winters, who first raised the alarm. Concerned by the absence of any activity from the house and unable to reach either Josh or Samantha by phone, she called the police to perform a wellness check. Officer Mark Ramirez, a seasoned member of the town's police department, arrived at the Davenport residence at approximately 10:30 a.m. on October 15th. His knock went unanswered, but he noticed a faint, unpleasant odor emanating from the house. Following protocol, Officer Ramirez circled the property, finding the back door unlocked. The smell intensified as he entered, leading him to the partially open basement door. What Officer Ramirez discovered in the basement would haunt him for years to come. Samantha's body lay in the center of a crude occult circle, surrounded by burned-out candles and bizarre symbols. Josh sat nearby, catatonic and covered in dried blood, still clutching his wife's lifeless hand. The crime scene investigators who arrived shortly after were confronted with a gruesome tableau that seemed more fitting for a horror movie than a suburban home. Forensic analyst Dr. Lydia Chen later remarked that in her 15 years on the job, she had never seen a crime scene so ritualistic in nature. The investigation, led by Detective Sandra Morris, quickly focused on unraveling the mystery of Josh's apparent descent into madness. A search of the Davenport home revealed a laptop in Josh's study, which proved to be a crucial piece of evidence. Cyber forensics expert Alan Tsung was brought in to analyze its contents. What Tsung discovered was disturbing. Months of forum posts and private messages documenting Josh's involvement with the cult. The sheer volume of data was staggering, painting a clear picture of Josh's gradual indoctrination and the cult's deliberate manipulation of his vulnerabilities. As investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover other cases across the country with similarities to the Davenport murder. A pattern emerged of lonely middle-aged individuals being drawn into the cult and subsequently committing violent acts. Meanwhile, Josh Davenport remained in a near catatonic state, unresponsive to questioning and seemingly unaware of his surroundings. He was placed under psychiatric hold at the local mental health facility, where Dr. Elena Rodriguez took charge of his care. Initial evaluations suggested a complete mental breakdown, with Josh alternating between periods of unresponsiveness and bouts of hysterical rambling about dark lords and promised power. As the investigation progressed, the community struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. A candlelight vigil was held for Samantha, attended by tens of local residents. The breakthrough in the Davenport case came 3 months after the murder, following tireless efforts by a joint task force of local law enforcement and FBI agents. The key to unraveling the mystery lay in a series of encrypted messages recovered from Josh's laptop, which cyber forensics expert Alan Tsung finally managed to decode. These messages revealed the true extent of the cult's operations and the sophisticated methods they used to manipulate vulnerable individuals. The cult's leadership structure was exposed, with the identity of the Crimson Prophet traced to a former psychology professor. Armed with this information, investigators coordinated simultaneous raids targeting key members of the cult. Crimson Prophet was apprehended at a remote compound where she had been living under an assumed identity. Josh Davenport finally emerged from his catatonic state. In a series of emotionally charged sessions with Dr. Rodriguez, he began to recount the events leading up to Samantha's murder. Josh's confession, filled with remorse and horror at his own actions, provided crucial details that helped prosecutors build their case against the cult leaders. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological tactics employed by the cult, while former members provided chilling accounts of their experiences. Josh Davenport, deemed mentally unfit to stand trial, was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility. His case became a focal point for discussions about criminal responsibility and the nature of culpability in cases of extreme manipulation. In the aftermath of the trial, lawmakers pushed for new legislation to combat online radicalization and protect vulnerable individuals from predatory groups. For the community, the resolution of the case brought a measure of closure, but the scars left by the tragedy ran deep. The Davenport house, once a crime scene and now a painful reminder, was eventually demolished. In its place, the community erected a small memorial garden dedicated to Samantha and other victims of the cult. Sabrina Brooks was known for her beauty and charm, qualities that had once captivated her husband, Robert. Their marriage seemed like a fairy tale, a perfect match that everyone admired. But the arrival of Robert's elderly mother, Miriam, into their home set off a chain of events that would end in unspeakable horror. Miriam was a frail but spirited woman, loved by her son and cherished by those who knew her. When Robert decided to bring her to live with them, he believed it was the right thing to do, a way to care for her in her twilight years. Sabrina, however, saw it differently. She viewed Miriam as an intruder, a threat to her domestic bliss. As tensions escalated, Sabrina's resentment turned to desperation. In a moment of madness, she concocted a deadly plan to rid herself of the woman she blamed for her misery. What followed was a chilling tale of premeditated murder, a crime that would leave an indelible mark on all who were touched by it. Sabrina and Robert's relationship began like a whirlwind romance. They met at a friend's wedding, where Robert, a successful architect, was immediately smitten by Sabrina's grace and vivacity. She worked as a freelance product photographer, and her creative spirit matched well with Robert's structured approach to life. After a brief courtship, they married and settled into a beautiful home on the outskirts of town. Miriam Brooks had lived a full life. Widowed for nearly a decade, she maintained her independence in a modest house in town. Her health had begun to decline, and Robert, ever the dutiful son, felt it was his responsibility to care for her. Miriam had always been a nurturing presence in Robert's life, and he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. Initially, Sabrina and Miriam got along well enough. Miriam was polite and grateful, and Sabrina, though slightly apprehensive, made an effort to welcome her mother-in-law. But as weeks turned into months, the strain of their living arrangement began to show. Miriam's constant presence disrupted the couple's privacy and routine, and Sabrina felt increasingly sidelined in her own home. Robert, caught between his wife and his mother, tried to balance their needs. He was patient and kind, hoping that time would ease the tension, but Sabrina's discontent only grew. She confided in her friends about the stress she was under, seeking advice on how to cope. Some suggested patience, while others hinted that Robert's loyalty to his mother might always overshadow his marriage. The situation worsened as Miriam's health declined further. She required more care and attention, which fell primarily on Sabrina during the day while Robert was at work. The constant demands wore on her, leading to frequent arguments with Robert. He, in turn, became defensive and frustrated, unable to understand why Sabrina couldn't be more accommodating. Sabrina's resentment festered, turning into a simmering rage. She felt trapped, her life overshadowed by an elderly woman who seemed to sap all the joy from her marriage. As her desperation grew, Sabrina's thoughts took a darker turn. She began to entertain the idea of a life without Miriam, envisioning the return of her once idyllic marriage. It was in these moments of bitterness and despair that the seeds of her deadly plan were sown. Robert's decision to bring Miriam into their home was not made lightly. He had seen his mother's health decline and knew she needed more support than he could provide from a distance. After long discussions with Sabrina, he convinced her that it was the best solution. Reluctantly, Sabrina agreed, though she harbored reservations about the impact on their marriage. The day Miriam moved in, Robert and Sabrina prepared a guest room with care. Robert was excited to have his mother close, and Sabrina, though uneasy, wanted to support her husband's decision. Miriam arrived with a few suitcases and a warm smile, grateful for her son's hospitality. In the beginning, the arrangement seemed manageable. Miriam was polite and tried not to impose. She kept to her room most of the time, reading or knitting, and joined the couple for meals and occasional outings. Robert was relieved to see his mother settled and safe, but Sabrina began to feel the strain almost immediately. Miriam's presence altered the dynamics of the household. Dinner conversations that once flowed easily between Sabrina and Robert now included Miriam's comments and stories. Robert's attention was divided, and Sabrina found herself missing the intimacy they once shared. The subtle shifts in their relationship gnawed at her, creating an undercurrent of resentment. The first major conflict arose over household routines. Miriam, accustomed to her way of doing things, often interfered with Sabrina's established methods. She would rearrange the kitchen, critique Sabrina's cooking, or offer unsolicited advice on housekeeping. Sabrina, who prided herself on running an efficient home, felt undermined and disrespected. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Miriam had criticized Sabrina's choice of dessert, the couple had a heated argument. Robert, exhausted from work and the constant tension, defended his mother, insisting that Sabrina was overreacting. Sabrina, feeling betrayed and isolated, lashed out, accusing Robert of always taking his mother's side. The arguments became more frequent. Robert, torn between his love for his wife and his duty to his mother, struggled to keep the peace. He tried to mediate, suggesting compromises and asking both women to be more understanding. But the underlying issues remained unresolved, and the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic. Sabrina's resentment deepened as she felt increasingly trapped in a situation she had never wanted. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, and she confided in a few about the constant stress she was under. Some offered sympathy, others advised her to stand her ground, but none could offer a solution that seemed viable. As the days turned into weeks, the initial harmony gave way to a persistent tension that permeated every aspect of their lives. The once warm and inviting home became a battleground of unspoken grievances and simmering anger. Sabrina's frustration reached a boiling point, and she began to fantasize about drastic measures to reclaim her life. Little did she know, those dark thoughts would soon manifest into a chilling reality. The tension in the Brooks household continued to rise, seeping into every corner of their lives. Miriam, oblivious to the depth of Sabrina's resentment, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She believed that with time things would improve, but Sabrina's patience was wearing thin, and her anger became harder to conceal. One morning, Sabrina discovered that Miriam had reorganized the pantry. What seemed like a minor inconvenience to Robert felt like a personal affront to Sabrina. She stormed into the living room where Miriam was sitting, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You can't just come in here and change everything. This is my house." Miriam looked up, startled. "I was only trying to help, dear. I didn't mean to upset you. It's not help when it's done without asking. You're just making things harder." Robert walked in just as Sabrina's voice rose, and he quickly stepped between them. "Sabrina, please calm down. She's just trying to help." Sabrina shot him a look of pure frustration. "You always take her side, Robert. I'm the one who has to deal with this every day." Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't about sides. We're a family. We need to work together." Despite Robert's attempts to mediate, the rift between Sabrina and Miriam grew wider. Sabrina started avoiding Miriam as much as possible, retreating to her studio to work on her graphic design projects. She found solace in her work, a temporary escape from the constant strain at home. But the escape was fleeting. Every time she left her studio, she was reminded of Miriam's presence. The small irritations accumulated, each one adding to the weight of her resentment. She began to dread coming home, the once safe haven now a source of continuous stress. Friends noticed the change in Sabrina. She became more withdrawn, her usual vibrant personality overshadowed by a constant undercurrent of tension. During a coffee outing with her close friend Julia, Sabrina finally opened up about the depth of her frustration. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Julia. She's everywhere all the time. It's like I'm living with a stranger in my own home." Julia listened sympathetically. "Have you talked to Robert about how you feel?" Sabrina let out a bitter laugh. "Talked? All we do is argue about her. He doesn't see how much it's affecting me. He just wants to keep the peace." Julia reached out and squeezed Sabrina's hand. "Maybe you need to take some time for yourself. Get away for a bit. Clear your head." Sabrina nodded, but deep down she knew that a temporary escape wouldn't solve her problems. The constant presence of Miriam in her home felt like a prison sentence, one she couldn't escape from. Her thoughts grew darker, and she began to entertain ideas she had once considered unthinkable. One night, as Sabrina lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed her mind that made her shudder. What if Miriam wasn't here anymore? The idea lingered, gaining strength with each passing day. It was a forbidden thought, one that brought a sense of both horror and twisted relief. As the days turned into weeks, the seeds of a plan began to take root in Sabrina's mind. She started researching methods to make someone ill, initially out of morbid curiosity. But the more she read, the more the idea of poisoning Miriam seemed like a viable solution to her predicament. It would be quick, discreet, and if done correctly, could appear as a natural death. Sabrina's desperation clouded her judgment. She convinced herself that this was the only way to regain control of her life and salvage her marriage. The dark thoughts that had once seemed so alien now felt like a lifeline. Little did she know this decision would lead her down a path of no return, with consequences far beyond her darkest imaginings. Sabrina's desperation reached its peak as she found herself more isolated and overwhelmed by the day. The once loving and harmonious relationship with Robert now felt like a distant memory, replaced by constant arguments and mutual resentment. She began to see Miriam not as an innocent elderly woman, but as the embodiment of all her marital problems. Confiding in friends became a regular outlet for Sabrina's frustration. During a particularly emotional conversation with her friend Lisa, Sabrina's true feelings came to the surface. "I can't do this anymore, Lisa. Every day is a battle. I feel like I'm losing myself." Lisa looked concerned. "You need to find a way to cope, Sabrina. Maybe you should see a therapist or take some time away." Sabrina shook her head. "Therapy won't change anything. The problem is Miriam. As long as she's here, nothing will get better." Lisa hesitated, then spoke softly. "Have you thought about asking her to move out? Maybe she could go to a care facility where she'd get the help she needs." Sabrina's eyes darkened. "Robert would never agree to that. He's too loyal. He'd see it as abandoning her." Lisa sighed. "I'm worried about you, Sabrina. This isn't healthy. You need to do something before it's too late." Sabrina nodded absently, but her mind was already elsewhere. She had considered every possible solution and always came back to the same conclusion. Miriam had to go. The idea of poisoning her mother-in-law, once a fleeting thought, now seemed like the only viable option. Sabrina began to meticulously plan Miriam's demise. She spent hours researching poisons, focusing on substances that would be difficult to detect. Her background in graphic design gave her an eye for detail, and she applied this skill to her dark new project. She discovered that certain plants, when ingested in small doses over time, could cause symptoms resembling a natural illness. With a plan in place, Sabrina started the next phase, obtaining the poison. She chose aconite, a potent toxin found in monkshood plants. It was a risky choice, but one that could be easily masked in food. She ordered the seeds online, ensuring they were delivered to a friend's address to avoid suspicion. The seeds arrived a few days later, and Sabrina carefully cultivated them in a hidden corner of her garden. She tended to them with a mixture of dread and determination, knowing that each day brought her closer to executing her plan. The process took weeks, during which the tension in the house continued to escalate. Miriam's health, already fragile, began to show signs of further decline. She frequently complained of stomach pains and nausea, symptoms that Sabrina dismissed with a feigned concern. Robert, ever the devoted son, grew increasingly worried, suggesting doctor visits and tests to determine the cause. Sabrina played her part well, expressing appropriate levels of worry and support. She accompanied Miriam to the doctor, reassuring Robert that they were doing everything possible. The doctors attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing health conditions, prescribing medications that did little to alleviate her suffering. The final stage of Sabrina's plan required careful timing. She waited for a day when Robert would be away for an extended period, ensuring she had the house to herself. She prepared a special meal for Miriam, infusing it with a small amount of aconite. The dose was low enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but high enough to exacerbate Miriam's symptoms. As Miriam ate the meal, Sabrina watched her with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. She felt a twisted sense of relief, believing that she was finally taking control of her life. But the act also brought a deep sense of guilt, one that gnawed at her even as she reassured herself that this was the only way. In the days that followed, Miriam's condition worsened. She grew weaker and more lethargic, her complaints of pain more frequent. Robert was beside himself with worry, while Sabrina maintained her facade of concern. The poison was doing its job, slowly but surely, and Sabrina felt both triumphant and terrified at the prospect of what she had set in motion. Sabrina's meticulous planning reached its final stages as she prepared to carry out the poisoning. The growing tension and escalating arguments with Robert only fueled her resolve. She was convinced that eliminating Miriam was the only way to restore harmony to her marriage and reclaim her life. Acquiring the aconite seeds had been a nerve-wracking process. Sabrina knew the risks involved in handling such a potent toxin, but desperation had clouded her judgment. She carefully cultivated the plants, watching them grow with a mix of dread and determination. Each step brought her closer to the point of no return. Sabrina spent hours in her studio, not working on her usual graphic design projects, but refining her plan. She researched the effects of aconite, ensuring she understood the symptoms it would produce. Vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain were common, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a severe but natural illness in an elderly woman like Miriam. Timing was crucial. Sabrina needed to administer the poison in such a way that it would slowly deteriorate Miriam's health, making her death appear as a natural progression of her existing ailments. She decided to mix small amounts of the aconite into Miriam's food over several weeks, gradually increasing the dosage. Sabrina's first attempt was a simple broth. She chose a day when Robert was working late, giving her the time and privacy she needed. Miriam, unaware of the sinister intent behind the meal, ate the broth without suspicion. Sabrina watched her carefully, noting any signs of discomfort. In the days that followed, Miriam began to complain more frequently of stomach pains and nausea. Sabrina played the concerned daughter-in-law, offering comfort and suggesting they visit the doctor. Robert, seeing Sabrina's apparent dedication, was grateful and less inclined to suspect any foul play. Sabrina continued to administer the poison, each dose carefully calculated to avoid immediate detection. She alternated the methods of delivery, sometimes mixing it into tea, other times blending it into soups or casseroles. Each meal brought Miriam closer to the brink, her health steadily declining. Despite her outward calm, Sabrina was racked with guilt and fear. The enormity of her actions weighed heavily on her, but she convinced herself that this was the only solution. She reminded herself of the life she would regain once Miriam was gone, a life free from the constant strain and arguments. Robert's increasing concern for his mother's health provided Sabrina with the perfect cover. He arranged for multiple doctor visits, each one yielding no definitive answers. The medical professionals attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing conditions, prescribing medications that did little to help. Sabrina's plan seemed to be working flawlessly. Miriam's decline was gradual, and the doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play. Sabrina's meticulous research and careful administration of the poison ensured that Miriam's symptoms matched those of a natural illness. The final dose was administered on a particularly stressful day. Robert had left for an extended business trip, leaving Sabrina and Miriam alone in the house. It was the perfect opportunity to deliver the fatal dose of aconite without immediate suspicion. The house felt unnaturally quiet, a silence that seemed to echo Sabrina's racing thoughts. Sabrina prepared Miriam's favorite soup, a creamy mushroom bisque. She measured the aconite carefully, her hand steady despite the turmoil inside her. This was it. There was no turning back. The poison, now finely ground and nearly invisible, was mixed into the soup with methodical precision. As she carried the bowl to the dining table, Sabrina forced a smile. "Lunch is ready, Miriam. I made your favorite." Miriam, looking frailer than ever, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, dear. You're so kind." Sabrina felt a pang of guilt but quickly suppressed it. She watched as Miriam slowly ate the soup, each spoonful bringing her closer to the end. The meal progressed in a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Miriam's labored breathing. As the poison took effect, Miriam's discomfort became evident. She clutched her stomach, her face contorted in pain. Sabrina maintained her facade of concern, suggesting they call a doctor. But the symptoms progressed rapidly, and soon Miriam was struggling to breathe. Sabrina dialed 911, her voice filled with feigned panic. "My mother-in-law is very ill. Please send an ambulance quickly." The paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Miriam in severe distress. They rushed her to the hospital, with Sabrina following closely behind. In the sterile confines of the emergency room, Sabrina watched as the doctors and nurses worked frantically to save Miriam. She maintained her act, shedding tears and expressing worry, but inside she felt a grim sense of relief. Despite their efforts, Miriam's condition deteriorated rapidly. The poison had done its job, and within hours Miriam passed away. The official cause of death was listed as complications from her existing health issues, exacerbated by her age. The doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play, and Sabrina's plan seemed to have succeeded perfectly. Robert was devastated when he received the news. He returned home immediately, shattered by the loss of his mother. Sabrina played the supportive wife, comforting him through his grief while hiding the dark truth. The funeral was a somber affair, with friends and family gathering to pay their respects. Sabrina's performance was flawless, her sorrow appearing genuine to all who observed, but the guilt gnawed at her. Each time Robert spoke of his mother's kindness and strength, Sabrina felt a stab of remorse. She had taken an innocent life, driven by desperation and resentment. The relief she had expected was overshadowed by the weight of her actions. She had crossed a line and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Robert threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from his grief. Sabrina, meanwhile, tried to resume her usual routines, but the shadow of her crime loomed large. She found it difficult to concentrate on her graphic design projects, her mind constantly replaying the events of that fateful day. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, but Sabrina attributed it to the stress of Miriam's death and the strain on her marriage. She continued to put on a brave face, maintaining the facade of a grieving daughter-in-law, but inside she was falling apart. One night, as she lay in bed beside Robert, the enormity of her actions hit her with full force. She had committed murder, taken a life to solve her problems, and now she had to live with the consequences. The thought was overwhelming, and Sabrina found herself trembling with a mix of fear and regret. Robert, sensing her distress, reached out to comfort her. But deep down, she knew that the truth could not remain hidden forever. The seeds of her crime were planted, and it was only a matter of time before they bore fruit. Sabrina's carefully constructed world was built on a foundation of lies, and as the days passed, she began to realize that the price of her actions would be far greater than she had ever imagined. In the aftermath of Miriam's death, life in the Brooks household settled into a somber routine. Robert's grief was palpable, and Sabrina did her best to support him, all the while masking her own turmoil. She believed she had successfully concealed her crime, but the peace she longed for remained elusive. Little did she know, the real consequences of her actions were about to unfold. The initial investigation into Miriam's death was routine. The doctors attributed her passing to natural causes, given her age and existing health conditions. However, a nurse who had been present during Miriam's final hours noticed something odd. The rapid progression of her symptoms seemed unusual, even for someone of her age. The nurse, Emma Collins, mentioned her concerns to the attending physician, Dr. Alan Harris. Emma was experienced and meticulous, not one to jump to conclusions. Dr. Harris, although initially dismissive, agreed to review Miriam's case notes. Upon closer inspection, he too found the rapid deterioration puzzling. They decided to conduct a more thorough autopsy, just to be sure. The autopsy revealed traces of a toxin in Miriam's system, something that should not have been there. Dr. Harris immediately alerted the authorities, and the case was escalated to the Greenwood Police Department. Detective Laura Rogan was assigned to lead the investigation. Detective Rogan was a seasoned investigator with a keen eye for detail. She began by interviewing the medical